Chapter 911. The exhausted team walked on the Biji Plateau in the early morning. Behind them were patches of light yellow grass, a sea of black gravel, a dry riverbed and the bones of dead beasts. Just as Dongfeng Yu had predicted, the radiation detector's index was indeed on the high side, but it didn't exceed what the human body could withstand. This was a very fortunate thing. Another fortunate thing was that due to the existence of this radiation, neither the Federation nor the Empire had sent any ground troops to this wasteland. As for whether or not there were any engineering mechs digging into the depths of the plateau, that was something they didn't know yet. For the people, the real danger now was the blazing sun. Not long after dawn, the high temperature instantly forced out the moisture in the human body. Then there was the somewhat unfamiliar sky without a trace of cloud. The bright light from the blue dome sprinkled down like a curtain of water, and when it came into contact with the black gravel ground, it was slightly distorted in the nearby area, shrouding the scene in front of them with a layer of unreality. Xiong Lingquan reached out and wiped the line of salt on his chin. Panting, he looked at a shallow tunnel entrance a few hundred meters in front of him and ordered with a hoarse voice, "Everyone enter." In order to delay the detection of the Federation's military satellites as much as possible, and to guard against attacks from the sky, their team had chosen to hide during the day and move out at night after entering the plateau. After dawn, they had to find a mining pit where they could hide in the shortest amount of time possible. Although the radiation index in the mining pit was higher, it was still bearable. Furthermore, they had to take this risk. Otherwise, if a random Federation fighter jet came, the entire team would die on this barren plateau. This abandoned mining pit was obviously not in use for long. The alloy supporting structure in the tunnel was still shining after the dust on the surface was wiped away. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the smooth surface of the metal under his finger, deep in thought. After a moment of silence, he turned around and looked at the extremely tired team members and said, "Everyone, hold on for 2 more days. As soon as we reach the Golan Highlands, there will be a ship coming to pick us up." After entering the plateau, with Gu Shifeng's help, he had made a few intermittent contacts with Philip, who was outside the atmosphere. They had discussed a plan to evacuate Emohua planet, so he was more confident. "You have to promise that it's not the Empire's ship," Dongfeng Yu said with a hoarse voice as he stared at his face. "I promise it's definitely not the Empire's ship," Sula replied. Gu Shifeng was giving Da Vinci and 4 drip when she suddenly turned around and asked curiously, "Boss, is that the ship that was so arrogant that it raised its middle finger in the capital city?" "Yes," Sula replied with a smile. He then threw his military backpack to Paul and sat down beside Dongfeng Yu's stretcher. He looked at her silently and didn't say anything for a long time. Silence usually represented a very clear attitude, but Xiong Lingquan was obviously more willing to choose a more direct approach. He stared at Dongfeng Yu's face and said, "This plateau radiation, and these obviously new mine tunnels. Dongfeng, do you still have something to say?" Dongfeng Yu was silent for a very long time, and then coughed painfully twice. He shook his head and said, "I don't know much. I only know that there should be some kind of strange mineral vein under the plateau's shallow layer of graphite. I've never seen or even heard of the ore produced there before. I only know that it contains very strong harmful radiation." Perhaps because he had recalled some very unpleasant memories, his eyebrows furrowed tightly, and he said hoarsely, "More than 2 years ago, NTR was responsible for escorting engineering mecha into this plateau. Because it was a top-secret mission, none of you know about it. In fact, the team I led back then had taken sufficient anti-radiation measures. But after the mission, 2 of the team members still contracted severe radiation sickness. I heard that they died not long after boarding the ship. The radiation is so strong. What is that?" The team members turned to look at Su Lo in shock. They were used to looking for answers directly from him when they encountered such questions. There are many natural radioactive elements in the universe, but those that can form mineral veins are relatively rare. But the way I see it, the crux of the problem is why the Federation wants to mine this kind of mineral vein. What is their goal? I don't know. Those who were able to come back alive from underground have all signed confidentiality agreements. Besides, I think that my luck is already good enough, so I don't want to ask these questions. Dongfang Yu frowned and replied, but there is one thing I can remind you of. This mission was directly ordered by the Department of Defense. It didn't even go through the headquarters. At the time, Du Xiaoqing was still the commander. In the entire federal military, there was only one person who could bypass him on planet Emohua. Su Le shook his head and said, but since you know about this matter, doesn't Du Xiaoqing have any doubts about it? Others don't dare to ask Li Jiedu, but he definitely does. I said before that I signed a confidentiality agreement. Besides, I'm no longer a direct subordinate of the commander. According to the commander's teachings, I can't report to him above my rank. Xiong Lingquan threw away the cigarette butt in his hand and said mockingly, like person like soldier. I wonder if Du Xiaoqing regrets teaching you so rigidly. The discussion about the strange radioactive mineral vein under the Biji Plateau did not go any further. For this fugitive team, their most important and only mission right now was to survive and board the ship that was coming to pick them up. The federal military upper echelons, or to be more precise, General Li Jiedu, had given the order to excavate this mineral. Was not a question that they had the energy and ability to think about right now. Even if they had a strong sense of justice and decided to maintain the peace of the universe, there was no way they could go deep into the plateau in this exhausted and broken state. Is it a new type of alternative energy source or something? Sulu walked to the end of the deep tunnel and looked at the slightly wet rock wall. The suspicion that had just appeared in his heart was immediately overthrown. According to the radiation intensity described by Dongfang Yu, it would be very difficult to turn this mineral into a stable and reliable energy source. Sitting down next to the stretcher, he looked at Da Vinci, who was still in a semi-conscious state. Sensing his increasingly long and steady breathing, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Why did he not feel any discomfort in such a low-intensity radiation environment? On the contrary, he even felt somewhat comfortable. It was hard to describe the feeling. The weak invisible radiation in the rock wall was like layers of warm waves that wrapped around his body, making every cell in his body excited from the inside out. After a moment of silence, he held Da Vinci's wrist softly and adjusted his breathing to be longer and gentler. He slowly released the magical burning power that was spreading out from a certain part of his back and carefully transmitted it to Da Vinci's body through his arm. He did not know if it would work, but a thought flashed in his mind that he wanted to try it. Maybe it was because the radiation in the tunnel was too warm. Chapter 9:12. In the abandoned mine tunnel, warmth flowed through the walls. Da Vinci, who had been in a semi-conscious state, gradually began to show some miraculous changes in his body. His pale cheeks suddenly became rosy, like a dried apple that had suddenly survived the double torture of time and air, becoming fresh again. Sula closed his eyes and frowned, not noticing this change. He continued to slowly and cautiously inject the miraculous energy into Da Vinci's body. Da Vinci's face became paler and paler, and his left shoulder began to tremble uncontrollably. It was extremely difficult. The team members who had been quietly resting noticed the situation and dragged their tired bodies over. When Xiong Linquan's palm landed on Su Li's shoulder, he suddenly opened his eyes and woke up. He smiled with difficulty and said, "I hope he can hold on." Da Vinci's appearance is a bit strange. Xiong Linquan frowned as he looked at the stretcher. Why does it feel like he's more energetic? Among the supplies at the edge of the forest, there was a considerable amount of medicine. Hearing Xiong Linquan's words, the team members hurriedly tore open the bags and replaced the medicine that was being injected into Da Vinci's body. Drip, drip, drip. The team members stared with wide eyes at the medicine that was silently dripping from the soft infusion tube. Their expressions were extremely serious and nervous. Everyone knew that this was a critical moment. If Da Vinci could withstand the strong stimulation of the hormone medicine and withstand the pressure in his blood vessels and wake up, then his life would be saved. If he couldn't wake up, then it would be very difficult for him to wake up in the future. After an unknown amount of time, the imperial soldier in the corner of the mine saw the index finger of the hand beside the stretcher tremble slightly. He cried out in shock. Then, to everyone's delight, Da Vinci, who had been unconscious for many days, finally opened his eyes and woke up. Someone dimmed the light to avoid irritating his eyes. Da Vinci looked at the blurry face in front of him in frustration and exhaustion. He probably knew that he was still alive. His ash-gray lips curled up with difficulty and squeezed out a smile. At this time, Gu Shifeng stopped repairing the equipment. She used her round fingers to hold a pair of thin tweezers and dipped them in some water. She carefully wiped away the dry debris at the corner of his eyes. She could not hide her joy and fear. She laughed and scolded him. "You really are the number 2 cockroach of Group 7. The cockroach was the symbol of a cockroach in the traditional culture of the military camp. It represented an incredible vitality and would not die no matter what. Hearing this description, the pale-faced Da Vinci smiled tiredly. His throat made some noises, but he could not say a complete syllable. Su Lu had already retreated to a corner and was wiping the sweat on his forehead with a towel. Previously, he had injected his true qi into Da Vinci's body purely as a subconscious reaction. He didn't expect that it would actually have some effect. He was pleasantly surprised. Hearing the word cockroach, he recalled the stories that Philip had once told him about the transformation of the 3 planets in the capital ring by the previous generation of human civilization. He could not help but smile. The earliest biological library was indeed comprehensive. Even such a small thing was not left out. Paul and the 3 imperial captives were in another corner of the mine. In the last battle before entering the Biki Plateau, they had also lost one person. The Empire and the Federation had been fighting for many years, and the hatred between them was difficult to eliminate. Although they had fought side by side with these Federation people, and although Su Lu had said before entering the plateau that this was the arrangement of fate, and that everyone was destined to live or die together, the 2 sides were still subconsciously divided into 2 parts and rarely communicated with each other. Looking at the lively scene, Paul lowered his voice and translated for his companions. Probably because they felt that it was difficult to understand why the Federation people regarded such ugly things as cockroaches as sacred, several of the Empire people could not help but laugh. The tunnel was very warm, and the atmosphere was very good because of the occasional laughter. Paul looked at that area and hesitated for a moment before breaking the long silence between the 2 sides. He asked Xiong Lingquan in choppy Federation language, "Then, who is the number 1 cockroach?" "The number 1 cockroach of Group 7? The Federation soldiers laughed and pointed to Su Lu in a tacit agreement. Xiong Lingquan smiled and replied, "Of course it's the boss. This guy seems to be unable to die no matter what kind of desperate situation he encounters. As the most fearless stone, he probably would not be willing to find trouble with death." Su Lu shrugged in front of everyone's eyes, tacitly agreeing with this statement, but he did not have the strength to take advantage of this rare harmonious atmosphere to say anything more. At this time, he just felt extremely tired and hungry, as if he had returned to the battlefield of the past. As long as he squeezed out all the true energy in his body, he would turn into a gluttonous monster. "Find something to eat." He looked at Paul and said, "I'm so hungry right now that I can swallow a mech." At this moment, Pearl's low and excited voice sounded from the battlefield infantry communication system. She, who was patrolling around the camp, found something interesting. "Boss, you have to come over. I found a few mechs." The starlight on the plateau was a little strange. When it fell on the gray protective suits of Su Lu and the others, it was suffused with a strange purple, and when it fell on the black gravel, it suddenly disappeared without a trace. Su Lu lifted his helmet and looked at the 2 charred and damaged military MX and a large excavation engineering mech in front of him. He was not shocked or disappointed by the degree of damage. In fact, before he came out, he knew very well that a mech that would be abandoned by the federal military definitely would not have much repair value. Of course, the so-called repair value here was the concept of normal mech repair, and did not necessarily include him, the main designer of the MX mech. Thus, he did not hesitate to walk towards the 3 piles of metal garbage, and began to climb up. The army can't leave the military MX to the Empire people. Since it did not self-destruct, it means that it has been judged to be of no repair value. or even possible to repair. An NTR team member said disappointedly. He had always been in charge of mech repair work in his original army and was very trusted. However, today, he found that his judgment was not supported by anyone. Everyone, including Pearl and Mountain Pow, was looking nervously at Su Lu, who was pulling something out of the mech wreckage. After a moment of puzzlement, they remembered Su Li's identity and immediately shut their mouths. The repair arm is good. Both arms are good. Su Lu stood up straight on the mech wreckage, both hands holding up a miniature repair arm. He shouted loudly at the team members below, looking as excited as a savage who had picked up a large bone. Can you repair it? Mountain Pow asked loudly. Su Lu put down the repair arm in his hands, patted his butt, and rubbed his hands together. He said with a smile, I'll try. Won't they notice if you make too much noise? Pearl pointed at the night sky. Chapter 913. Like stone sculptures that had been eroded by the wind for many years, the two military MX mechas and one engineering drilling mecha lay quietly and sorrowfully on the plateau. The auxiliary wings behind the mecha had completely fallen off and were nowhere to be seen. The alloy plate track outside the left mechanical leg was broken. The fire control firmware in the hidden door of Block 41 had clearly been cut in two by the alloy blade. The auxiliary balance instrument had failed. The infrared auxiliary capture system was like the lower half of a transvestite, slumped between the abdomen. When Su Lu began to repair the broken mecha on the plateau, in just a short 10 seconds, he discovered so many seemingly unsolvable problems. The upper bodies of the two charred mecha were even more wretched. The main infrared sensors had flipped out of their shells, glowing like fruit juice. The SCC global monitoring system and large radius high-sensitivity radar on the neck and chest area were severely damaged. What was even more frightening was that the twin engines behind the mecha's waist could no longer be seen. The Z4 electron jet in the mid-upper storage room was twisting and turning like the electronic particles it had originally contained. There was no way to repair such a serious problem, which was why the NTR repair soldier from before had been dejectedly sentenced to death. Su Lu frowned as he watched for a long time. The miniature mechanical repair arm in his hand began to turn. The low humming sound spread out for tens of meters in the darkness of the wasteland, disappearing as the dark yellow grass and black gravel rubbed against each other. The low humming sound of the rotating motor, the crisp clanging of metal, and the ear-piercing sound of metal rubbing against each other. Once it started, it did not stop for a long time. Pearl and the other members of Mountain Cannon watched the busy figure on the mecha nervously. From time to time, they would pass various parts according to his instructions. As the repair process progressed, layer by layer, luck began to envelop all the fugitives. The three mecha were like three severely disabled people. The one without arms had legs, and the one with a head injury had healthy legs. The so-called piecing together, or rather, making up for each other, happened in this way. The darkness of the night faded away, and the morning sun gradually rose. When the light on the BG plateau was still dim, the exhausted Su Lu wiped the sweat off his forehead and entered the cockpit under the expectant gazes of his team members. He groped around in the dark and found the left control stick. His fingers quickly pressed the 17 intact quick touch buttons and completed the start group action command. Su Li's lips curled into a smile. 3 days later, in the BG plateau, a fierce battle was taking place. This was what Su Lu and the others had expected, but they didn't expect this day to come so quickly. The airborne missiles danced in the air, and then turned into countless deathly gray and black flowers that bloomed on the black plains, forming a large circle that surrounded the lone team. The high-speed machine artillery shells were like countless sharp blades, simply and directly splitting open the dry earth. Occasionally, they would hit the center of the circle, smashing viciously against the tough alloy armor, making dull and terrifying thuds. The 4 Federal Close-Air Grey Hawk fighter jets soared through the blue sky at high speed like ferocious birds. They wantonly unleashed cannon fire, completely overturning a certain temporary tunnel camp of the lone army. They looked so insufferably arrogant. However, upon closer inspection, one would discover that the attacks of these 4 Close-Air Grey Hawk fighter jets were actually very careful. They were trying their best to increase the distance between them and the ground. Because of this kind of careful combat posture, the seemingly fierce firepower against the ground appeared to be very scattered, and those bullets that could hit the target were ineffective. Because within the lone team, there was a dark black, clumsy, bloated, and even strange mecha. This was a monster that didn't look like an MX, nor did it look like an engineering mecha. Its left and right were extremely unbalanced, and its mobility was severely reduced. It only had a seemingly strong body, but it was like a stupid boar, twisting its muddy butt. However, such an ugly mech that had been pieced together was able to bitterly hold on under the attacks of the 4 close-range combat aircraft. It protected its team members who were trying to hide below. The modified Darlin's autocannon on its left mechanical arm had even formed a powerful anti-air firepower. Pay attention to concealment. 6 o'clock. Mecha crouch. From time to time, Su Li's quick but still calm orders rang out in the individual soldier system. Under his command, the small team of more than 10 people cooperated with the clumsy mecha, dodging in near-perfect synchronization. Amidst the cloud of dust and the whistling of bullets, they remained unscathed. It was only at this moment that most of the people, including Xiong Lingquan, finally understood why Su Li had insisted on bringing this clumsy, pieced-together piece of trash with them, when they had thought that it had no combat ability at all, even at the expense of slowing down the team's advance. That was because when faced with an aerial attack, there was no other mecha, not even the most advanced intact MX mecha, that could protect everyone's lives better than this crappy metal monster. But being attacked without end, unable to mount an effective counterattack, the lone team could only walk step by step towards death. Even though they could almost see the dejected and anxious faces of those 4 Federation pilots in their minds, the people fighting desperately on the ground still felt a chill run through their bodies. 20 kilometers to the south, 4 of them, about an entire company. I'm guessing it's Small Eyes people. In the dim cockpit, Gu Shifeng glared at the global surveillance system that had just been repaired by her chubby fingers. She looked at the clear dots of light. Like a woman who was about to be raped, she screamed helplessly and angrily. Targets that had been tracked by the glory of the Charter could not hide, and targets that had been locked down by the Federation Air Force could not escape. Right now the assault force from the base was about to arrive. Hearing Gu Shifeng's message, the team members, who were already extremely cold, suddenly became even more nervous. Even the few Empire soldiers who did not understand the Federation language seemed to feel the intent of death in this dry world. Gu Shifeng stared expectantly at Su Li's face beside her. Su Li's face was expressionless, but his heart could not calm down. Earlier, when he had contacted Philip, he had not found a feasible method. Faced with this situation, he had no other ideas. Where could they retreat to? No, this lone team had no place to retreat to. Su Li stared at the roaring mecha in the sky through the SCC. He looked at the group of armed robots in the distant horizon that was about to become visible. He licked his lips. Right at this moment, a sharp alarm suddenly sounded in the dim cockpit. Su Li's brows furrowed. He did not understand where the alarm was coming from. Could it be that there was an even more despairing unknown danger before this hopeless situation? A terrifying tremor suddenly descended upon the BG plateau. The crappy assembled mecha froze on the spot, and then fell forward heavily. The team members beside the thick mechanical legs were thrown into the air with pale faces. Smoke and dust covered the entire area, covering the world. Chapter 9:14. A sudden earthquake descended on the BG plateau. The wrath unleashed by the Creator when he occasionally raised his eyes brought endless disasters to the world. The entire world instantly changed its color and appearance. Even the human beings with the most cutting-edge technology, the soldiers with the strongest willpower, and the experts with the most extraordinary abilities couldn't resist this terrifying power. They could only search for a safe place in the smoke and dust in fear and uneasiness, shouting for their companions in vain. The tremors that were equivalent to the detonation of countless explosives at the same time swept from the depths of the plateau to the surface. In only a short time, they had turned the black, hot gravel into soft biscuits and turned the vast land into a garbage dump. For the army, the most terrifying thing was not the power of the tremors, but the electromagnetic interference that raged in the air and on the ground like a storm at the beginning of the earthquake. A few screams of panic rang out in the systems of the 4 Federation Sparrow Hawks. Then, no sound could be heard anymore. The grayish-black streamlined fuselage flipped helplessly in the air and crashed into the ground like a sparrow hawk after being shot, turning into a few clusters of flames and alloy structural fragments that filled the sky. The helicarrier that flew over from the horizon was like a drunkard who had too much to drink in the violent and tangible smoke and the invisible, but even more violent electromagnetic turbulence. It managed to hold on for a while, but in the end, its legs couldn't help but give way, and it fell into the garbage dump in a sorry state. There were faint sounds of explosions. In the black smoke, it was unknown how much damage the helicarrier had suffered. It was also unknown how many of the elite soldiers of the small-eyed special forces on the helicarrier had died in a foreign land because of the earthquake. In a deep valley at the edge of the BG Plateau, the night that was usually starry and cloudless was now gray. No matter where one looked, it was the same, boundless, and without any sense of direction. The dusty Sulu couldn't care less about his dry and bleeding lips. He forced himself to support his exhausted body and counted the number of people in the team with the help of the night vision lights with Xiong Lingquan. In the end, they confirmed that everyone was still alive. The two of them looked at each other and couldn't hide the luck and fear in their eyes. There were no buildings or giant rocks on the plateau, and the Federation's attack force was destroyed by the electromagnetic turbulence. At the most dangerous moment, Philip played a guiding role. But even with these conditions, the fact that this lone army, which had survived hundreds of battles, could walk out of the earthquake zone unscathed and come to this valley could only be described as a miracle. It was definitely not accurate to say that they were unscathed. All of the team members had various wounds on their bodies and faces. Da Vinci, who had just woken up, fell into a coma again and started to have a fever. Dongfang Yu, on the other hand, struggled to climb down from the stretcher at the critical moment and insisted on walking. The wound on her chest and abdomen tore open again, and blood oozed out at a terrifying rate. However, at least everyone was still alive. Even that stupid mech that had been repaired or put together at the last minute didn't fall apart, persevering until they reached the valley. If it wasn't for this earthquake, all of us would have to die here today. Xiong Lingquan slowly and seriously chewed on the 4th last cigarette. Then, he slowly raised his head and stared at Su Li's ordinary face with an extremely serious and even somewhat strange gaze. His face was so ordinary that it was unusual, because it was still so ordinary under such circumstances. Xiong Lingquan said in a hoarse voice, "Boss, did the Creator really favor you?" "Don't use the word favor." Su Li frowned and criticized. His throat was very painful. With every word he said, he could feel the blood coming out from his throat due to the friction between his vocal cords. He didn't know if it was because he had breathed in too much smoke, or because he had called for his team members to report their position too many times during the earthquake. However, he was very sure that today's earthquake was just a small probability event. It wasn't because the Creator had a special favor for him. If he had to say that this kind of luck was wearing a holy cloak, then it would be better to say that Philip, who was on the spaceship, used his powerful calculation and analysis ability to point out a path for the team to cross the Dead Sea. Although this path was full of thorns, flowers bloomed at the end. Xiong Lingquan was silent for a moment before he said in a hoarse voice, "I don't want to die in the hands of my own people. The earthquake can only help us cover our tracks for a while. We're going to the Golan Highlands tomorrow. I feel that it's very dangerous there." Sulu used an even more hoarse voice to reply, "The spaceship that comes to pick us up must quietly avoid the Federal fleet and the ground's anti-air network. According to my calculations, the Golan Highlands is the best place to land. That highland is far away from the Federation's main battle zone. As long as we calculate the time accurately enough, we can get on the spaceship before the base can react." Thinking about the danger that Xiong Lingquan was worried about, he slowly narrowed his eyes and said softly, There's something you should know first. According to the results of my calculations, if the base finds our tracks tomorrow, then they will definitely send the retreating mecha squad from the Straits War Zone to try and kill us in one fell swoop. Because it's closer. Xiong Lingquan frowned and asked. Other than that, it's also because they're stronger. Su Li's expression suddenly became extremely relaxed. He looked at him and smiled. It's Madman Li's personal mecha battalion. Hearing the name Madman Li, Xiong Lingquan was stunned for a moment. He angrily spat out the bitter ashes in his mouth onto the ground. He glanced at Su Lo and couldn't help but shake his head. As one of the most outstanding officers in the Federation, Xiong Lingquan knew very well what kind of awe-inspiring military ability that young officer called Madman Li had. Although the other was still only a colonel, he was far from being an expert that he could contend against. According to the information that Gu Shifeng had eavesdropped on, this battle in the Straits had been single-handedly commanded by this person. He was the continuation of the glory of the Lees of Philadelphia's military god. He had the reputation of being unrivaled in the entire military camp at the age of 16. The mottled golden stars that represented the number of enemies he had killed had long filled the two strong mechanical legs of Zhanxi. He was an unparalleled expert on par with the Empire's Princess Hui Chaoshi. Yes, their most powerful leader had once defeated the other. At the very least, his strength was definitely not weaker than that madman's. However, could it be that they would expect their leader to operate that crappy compatible machine to go against the most advanced MXD controlled by Madman Li? The earthquake was a blessing bestowed by the heavens. It was a myth. If Xiong Lingquan hoped that Su Lu could still defeat Madman Li in this state, and that the team could still escape from this hopeless situation, then it was no longer a myth, but a joke. Su Lu noticed Xiong Lingquan's slight shaking of his head, and knew what he was thinking. However, a gentle smile hung on the corners of his dry and bloodied lips, thinking that after leaving the valley tomorrow, he might see that guy's violent and proud figure. His mood became somewhat strange. He was not anxious, but abnormally calm. I understand him. Su Lu stood up, patted Xiong Lingquan's shoulder, and said, so I can deal with him. Chapter 9:15. After entering the tunnel, Xiong Lingquan told his concerns and Su Li's analysis to the team members. The stone walls that were darker than the valley began to fill with an oppressive and tense atmosphere. The team members' expressions were very heavy. From time to time, they looked up and seemed to inadvertently glance at Su Li's figure. They knew very well that if the lone army was intercepted by Colonel Li Feng's mecha battalion before boarding the spaceship, the remaining 1 in 1,000 survival rate would all be on the boss. After the Empire people in the team heard Paul's analysis in a low voice, their faces full of thick beards were full of panic. They were even more frightened than the team members because until now, they still didn't know the true identity of Su Lu. But they knew very well how terrifying the Federation officer named Madman Li was. The dim backlight flickered slightly. An Empire person held his head in despair and cursed a few words in the Empire language with a Northern Star region accent. They fought for a long time on this meat grinder-like Emohua planet and were defeated by the lake. Then, they were inexplicably captured by this Federation team. After a series of battles, they entered the plateau and encountered earthquakes, but in the end, they still couldn't get rid of the shadow of death. However, this was already deep into the actual control area of the federal military. Other than desperately running with this Federation team, and hoping that the goddess of luck who was laughing more and more at them, what else could they do? The Imperial soldier who buried his head between his knees spoke faster and faster. His hoarse voice suddenly became sharp, and then without any warning, it turned into a roar mixed with crying. His thin and weak shoulders kept trembling, and tears dripped down from his dirty beard. Shan Pao and several other Federation soldiers stared at the corner in shock and vigilance. Their palms slowly moved to the side of their guns. They didn't want to become the victims of stray bullets at this critical moment, because of an Empire brat's mental breakdown. He's cursing the Empire military department and the big and small nobles in his hometown. Well, he's just cursing the other party's mother over and over again. There's nothing new. You probably don't know very well that in the Empire, ordinary civilians, especially slaves, don't have much opportunity to receive education. Sula looked at the sobbing soldier and frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he continued to translate to his team members. Right now, he is scolding the military intelligence department. They said that those bastards only know how to play tricks and frame their colleagues. They threw their strongest reserve team into the encirclement of 3 mecha operators from the Federation, just because their team didn't have the royal family's insignia and came from the northern starfield. They never liked the orthodox military. Hearing Su Li's translation, the tension in the team gradually relaxed. They silently looked at the other side and naturally thought of their own experiences. They thought of the pursuit by the base, the infamous Federal Investigation Department of the federal government, and the small-eyed special forces that had left many of their brothers lying in a pool of blood. They felt sorrow in their hearts, and only then did they realize that everyone was in the same situation. The tunnel was silent. The people of the Federation and the Empire had fought side by side for the past 10 days. Even if there was no friendship, there was some trust between them. They also felt the same emotions. Thus, they all closed their eyes tiredly and began to prepare for the final battle tomorrow. Sula didn't close his eyes. He checked on Da Vinci's condition and sat down beside the simple makeshift stretcher. He rubbed his slightly tangled eyebrows and silently looked at everyone's faces. He saw the helplessness and pressure in everyone's hearts. Just hearing the name Madman Li almost made the Empire soldiers collapse. It could be imagined how terrifying that person was in their hearts, including Shan Pao and Xiong Lingquan. The Federation soldiers also found it difficult to suppress their nervousness and despair. If the battle was fair, the members of Group 7 would definitely be full of confidence in Su Lu. However, the problem now was that the Federation military wouldn't give them any fair chance to fight. Conspiracy, framing, pursuit base, and small number of people, the division between justice and betrayal. There was no fairness in this matter. We might die tomorrow, so I have something to say to you. Lying on the stretcher beside Su Lu was Dongfang Yu, the former high-ranking officer of the Iron 7th Division, whose wound had split open again, turned his head with difficulty and said with a hoarse voice, "The purge targeting Group 7 definitely has nothing to do with the division commander. I hope you can believe this." Although the members leaning against the stone wall of the tunnel had their eyes closed, they were thinking about many things. Perhaps it was like how some literary novels described, seizing the last moment to reminisce about the most beautiful scenes of their lives. They weren't really asleep at all. When they heard this, they all opened their eyes and looked at him with puzzled frowns. Dongfang Yu didn't seem to feel the mixed emotions in those gazes. His face was expressionless, and his hoarse voice was abnormally calm. It was very obvious that he was just trying to give some explanation before he left this world. Also, the attack on Group 7 on planet Yellow Doom had nothing to do with the division commander, because I was the one who did it. Several members of Group 7 died because of that incident. Logically speaking, I should have died a long time ago. I also wanted to kill myself, but I didn't expect bad people to live for 1,000 years. I didn't die even after staying in NTR for 3 years. And I was still alive even after taking a radiation bath in the BG Plateau. This time, I've been lying on a stretcher for more than 3 goddamn months. And you all still refuse to fucking throw me away. Dongfang Yu frowned deeply and said while panting, "Fine, I must accept your kindness. But I still want to tell you that this matter really has nothing to do with the division commander." There was a saying in the Federation, "A person who is about to die will not lie." The silent members in the tunnel believed Dongfang Yu's explanation, and they were so tired that they didn't have the strength to be angry about the incident on planet Yellow Doom. Su Lu silently looked at Dongfang Yu's ears that had been cut into 2 by Lao Bai, and suddenly said, "I never believed that Du Xiaoqing would do that kind of thing. But I have something I always wanted to ask you. Before you were transferred to planet Yellow Doom, did you ever think that my people would die?" Dongfang Yu tightly pursed his gray lips and didn't say a word. Silence doesn't mean tacit agreement. Perhaps you are helping someone to hide it. Su Lu calmly looked at him and said, "Besides Du Xiaoqing in this world, The only people that you are willing to take the blame for are your dead comrades. I knew very early on that it was Shimin Jin's idea, including the modification of the Bureau of Proclamations data. He was already killed by this young master, and his corpse was hung outside the Parliament Mountain for all to see. He was humiliated, yet you still wanted to help him keep his secret and protect his dignity. Isn't that a bit too stupid? Dongfang Yu stared at his face. Sula said, I don't care if you ever thought about killing my people, and I don't care if you have redeemed all your sins. Try to survive tomorrow, and we can talk about other things later. I believe that no matter if it's Jie, Jiewen, or Mr. Shi, they will all agree to this. As soon as he finished speaking, there was another tremor from deep underground. Gu Shifeng spat out the grass in her mouth, took off her earpiece and said, The surveillance has found it. 11. 2 meters underground in the mine area. Chapter 916. Level 6. 1. Gu Shifeng stared at the data feedback on the light screen and suddenly frowned. She extended a dirty, round finger and forcefully slashed at the wavy curve that suddenly rose from the bottom of the light screen. She said in shock, The second sequence of clutter is so neat. What's going on? What does this mean? Sulo asked. It means that the underground is in a state of secondary induction. In other words, someone made a big explosion down there and didn't expect to cause the rock strata to move and cause an earthquake. Gu Shifeng turned her head and looked at him cautiously. She lowered her voice and said, Although the location of the epicenter isn't accurately determined, looking at the depth, it should be in the deep mining area mentioned in the east. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed. After a moment of silence, he said, A big explosion deep underground. Could it be that the federal military is trying to cover up some traces? The lone army at the edge of the plateau guessed at the tremors deep underground and wondered if the federal military was trying to cover up some secret. However, the Federation's frontline headquarters in the base didn't notice the 2 earthquakes at all. All of their attention was focused on them, and they didn't hide their anger and murderous intent at all. In the dimly lit command room, the Federation's commander-in-chief, Lieutenant General Hu Lian, looked at his subordinates with a gloomy face. His voice was cold as he said, I don't care about electromagnetic interference or sudden earthquakes. I only know that the rebel army has less than 10 people, but they managed to survive for more than half a month under the eyes of the Federation's best generals. They crossed 400 kilometers of the BG Plateau and didn't even lose a hair. He slowly leaned forward and stared at the head of the Air Force's Operations Department. He asked, How are you going to solve this problem? When can the fighter jet group leave? That's a high radiation zone. The battle plan forbids fighter jets from entering. Also, no one would have thought that with just a few people, they would be lucky enough to pick up a military mecca on the plateau. The head of the Air Force's Operations Department wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and explained with a trembling voice, General, electromagnetic interference still exists after the earthquake. This is an objective fact. I can't let my pilots take the risk. Also, during the last battle, the Air and Ground Joint Command System was suddenly invaded by external signals. I think we should find the answer to this problem first. There is no answer. Lieutenant General Hu Lian waved his right arm angrily and said in a deep voice, What you need is action, not thinking. In the end, humans were creatures that relied on thinking to get to where they were today. Even in the army with strict military discipline, even if they were soldiers whose duty was to obey orders, they still couldn't help but think when faced with the highest command of the federal military. This was especially the case for the 7 or 8 generals of the ground forces. They sat in their chairs and didn't say anything. However, the expression on their faces and the expression in their eyes, as well as the long period of silence and disregard, fully expressed their attitude. The atmosphere in the combat command room was very stifling. The Air Force combat troops nodded and began to prepare the airstrike plan in the early hours of the morning. The generals of the ground forces slowly looked at each other, and then one of them opened his mouth to question. The commander of the 11th Division, Major General Chung Mo, who had just returned from the bloody battle in the Southwest War Zone, frowned and looked at the commander on the stage. he said with a hoarse voice. Sir, I still have my reservations about this accusation. In my opinion, the new 17th Division NTR is the most outstanding and most resilient group of soldiers in the federal military. They have no reason to betray us. After a short pause, without waiting for General Hu Lian to reply, Major General Cheng Imo said in a deep voice, Betrayal always needs a reason. They were carrying out the most dangerous mission. Now, only less than 10 people out of 70 are left. Furthermore, they have already completed the mission. Once they return, they will become heroes of the Federation. What reason do they have to abandon their glory and homeland and rely on those hairy people of the Empire? The generals of the Federal Military Ground Forces had already begun to have doubts about the command center's order to spare no effort in hunting down that small group of rebels. Especially after the previous conflict, they were even more conflicted. They always felt that there was a thick smell of conspiracy, and as an iron-blooded soldier, they were the most resistant to this point. Lieutenant General Hu Lian slowly raised his eyebrows and looked around at the people in the room with a cold expression. He was not Du Xiaoqing. He did not have the qualifications or charisma to suppress this group of arrogant and powerful generals who had been on the battlefield of life and death for many years. If he could not take out something powerful at this moment, then he might face a very embarrassing siege. He might even have to pay a price for the previous conflict. Even if he used his superior's authority to suppress these people in the end, he would never be able to regain his dignity. Hu Lian's furrowed eyebrows gradually relaxed. He tapped lightly on the table with an expressionless face and brought up dozens of high-definition ground photos, continuously taken by military satellites. A rebellion needs a reason. A group of the Federation's most outstanding soldiers betraying the Federation even more needs a reason. I understand your doubts. Hu Lian looked at the small group of rebels who had escaped in the photos, looked at the two simple stretchers, and looked at a certain person whose face was blurry, but whose features could be seen clearly in the crowd. He said, I think all of you should recognize this person. He turned around and looked coldly at these valiant and proud division commanders. Looking at their shocked expressions and their tightly pursed lips, he could not help but feel happy. He said slowly, You need a reason. The betrayal of these outstanding soldiers needs a reason. In my opinion, Su Li's appearance is the simplest reason. The generals in the room could not suppress their shock as they stared at the blurry face in the photos. Some of them were the division commanders of the Federation's elite divisions, and some of them were the commanding officers of the ground forces. However, they knew very well the power of this face. Yes, in the eyes of many people, including them, the outstanding soldiers of Old Seven's group had no reason to betray the Federation. However, as long as Su Lu appeared in front of them, they would die for him at any time, let alone betray him. The battle command room was silent. The air mixed with the smell of tobacco and coffee suddenly froze. No one opened their mouths to speak. Hu Lian looked at everyone's reaction and turned his head to stare at He Lei, who was being restrained by two military police in the corner. He said coldly, Division Commander He Lei, you must be suspended from your duties and be investigated by the Military Law Office. I understand today, so I forgive your rashness. However, if you pull out your gun again, place it on the table, and scream, I will shoot you directly. He Lei's face was ashen. His two arms, which were being held by the military police, trembled violently. He wanted to say something, wanted to do something. However, looking at the instructor's face in the photos, which had not changed at all 3 years ago, he lost all of his strength. Chapter 917. The new 17th Division was on the brink of a mutiny. The new 17th Division was preparing for a mutiny. This ace division with a glorious military history had inherited the undisciplined and ruthless style left behind by their predecessors. They were used to shielding their own, good at external battles, and good at internal strife. When there was a need to abide by military discipline, they were the role models of strict military discipline. On the battlefield of life and death, they often forgot about military discipline out of habit. If they had only focused on discipline, their old teacher Li Pifu would not have been able to lead them to such a shocking achievement. If their hands and feet could be easily bound by the word discipline, Yu Chenghai would not have been able to protect so many members of Group 7 3 years ago. Furthermore, during the 3 years when Du Xiaoqing had been commander-in-chief, they had still been as strong and fierce as ever. When the soldiers of the division found out that their comrades had been inexplicably accused of mutiny and then hunted down by the base and that damned Joint Investigation Department, there was no way they could remain calm and wait patiently like little white rabbits for the final result. Their reaction was very direct. Under the cloud of conspiracy hanging over the base, all levels of officers of the 17th Division began to secretly mobilize their forces with the theme of defending against a surprise attack. In the armory at night, the sound of the 100 or so heavy MX mecha self-checks could be faintly heard. If the upper echelons of the federal military could not give a convincing explanation, if that damned Joint Investigation Department did not hand over the culprits who had hunted down Team NTR, if they could not make the more than 10,000 soldiers of the new 17th Division feel good, then what would happen next around the base was something that no one, including Lieutenant General Hu Lian, could imagine. He was escorted back to the headquarters of the new 17th Division by the military police. His face was ashen as he looked at his subordinates around the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "This is the front lines. Do you want the 17th Division to be the first unit in history to rebel on the front lines? We are not rebelling." The new 17th Division's mecha commander, Hua Xiaoxi, looked at him with a serious expression and said, "We need to put enough pressure on the base. Otherwise, I cannot imagine how many more days Xiong Lingquan and those fellows can hold out." Lin Ai frowned at He Lei and said, "What exactly happened in the command room? Why is division commander's expression so ugly?" "I have already been officially suspended from duty." He looked at the group of senior military officers in the room and said, "But I have to warn all of you. Stop all troop movements immediately. Otherwise, no one will be able to bear the consequences once the headquarters determines that there is a mutiny." Hua Xiaoxi silently pulled the trigger and said, "It's not a mutiny attempt. If this matter can't be resolved, so what if there really is a mutiny?" He raised his head and looked at He with a cold gaze. "It's not that I want to criticize you, but you're really too soft. If the instructor was the commander now, would he watch as our soldiers were slaughtered like rabbits? If he was the one who went to the base to negotiate, do you think he would have pulled out a gun and placed it on Hu Lian's table like you did? No, he'll just shoot that old bastard." He looked out of the door, and his gaze fell on the military police. He lowered his head and looked at his junk box. He laughed at himself and said in a hoarse voice, "Xiong Lingquan and the rest are with the instructor now. This is why the headquarters is chasing after them." The room suddenly fell silent. Miss Hulyu, who had just arrived last night, asked with a livid expression, "Is the news confirmed?" He picked up his junk box and walked out of the door. From today onwards, he was no longer the commander of the 17th Division, but a criminal officer who had been imprisoned. When he reached the threshold, he suddenly stopped and turned back to look at the crowd sternly. "After I leave, none of you are allowed to act rashly. The 4th and 13th Divisions have completed their mobilization last night. It's obvious that they are targeting our division. Also, I have to remind all of you that regardless of whether this is a conspiracy or a purge, if there really is a mutiny, those big shots in the Capitol ring will righteously get rid of all of us." In the dim room, Director Bailey of the Joint Investigation Department looked at the back of the figure by the window with a smile, secretly pondering the true thoughts in the general's mind. The mobilization of the troops has been completed. No matter what the new 17th Division wants to do, they won't be able to do anything new. Also, I think you must really want them to be a little more impulsive. To deal with the troops left behind by Lord War God, without an absolutely correct excuse, is indeed a kind of trouble. Lieutenant General Hu Lian turned around and said slowly with an expressionless face, "Lord War God's ever-victorious division is now under the control of a bunch of impulsive idiots. This is a great humiliation to the Federation." I won't deny that I really want to use this opportunity to complete a purge." After a short pause, he looked at Director Bailey and said mockingly, "But do you really think I'm stupid enough to cause a mutiny in the troops? When the time comes, neither you nor I will be able to bear the responsibility." Director Bailey did not respond to the general's mockery. The smile on his face gradually faded as he said in a serious tone, "That spaceship has been trying to escape the surveillance and enter the atmosphere. It's obvious that it wants to help the rebel army leave. Which side does that spaceship belong to? We haven't been able to capture a reliable image, but it definitely can't be an Empire spaceship." Director Bailey shrugged and said, "It's probably that strange spaceship that ran amok in S1 3 years ago. Only that strange spaceship could have such terrifying speed." Lieutenant General Hu Lian walked to the side of the table with a serious expression. Looking at the blinding red arc on the electronic map, he was silent for a moment before saying, "These people were able to break through here. This is beyond my expectations, but they must die. Colonel Li Feng and his mecha clan are currently retreating from the Straits battle zone. They are closest to the highlands." Director Bailey understood what he meant and raised an objection with a frown. "No one will doubt Colonel Li Feng's ability, but the problem is his personal relationship with Su Le. Will there be any problems?" Lieutenant General Hu Lian took off his military cap and stroked his white hair. "As far as I know, Colonel Li Feng once made a promise to Commander Shaoqing. He will not let Su Le go." Director Bailey smiled slightly. He thought that since that promise was only between Du Shaoqing and Li Feng, then you must have received guidance from Chairman Li Jiedu to know about it. Naturally, he would not point this out. His gaze shifted slightly for a moment, and then he suddenly asked, "Regarding the continuous earthquakes on the BG Plateau, I wonder if the commander has any opinion? According to the Bureau of Proclamations surveillance, deep underground, it seems." Before he could finish, he was cut off by a pair of cold eyes. Lieutenant General Hu Lian stared at him coldly, not bothering to hide the threat and cold-bloodedness in his words. "Investigate what you should, but don't ask about what you shouldn't. Don't forget, this is the front line, a place where stray bullets fly everywhere." Director Bailey's heart clenched. He knew that he had stepped into an area that he definitely should not have, so he immediately shut his mouth. In order not to become the highest-ranking official of the Federation to die from stray bullets, he would not mention anything related to earthquakes until the day he died. Perhaps it was July on Emohua planet. The sky was burning. In the early morning, a heavy object that looked like a meteorite came from the deep universe and crashed into the atmosphere that surrounded the planet. It whistled and tore apart the air that was getting thicker and thicker, leaving behind a dazzling trail of fire. Then, it turned into a white pillar of smoke and fell on the horizon. The surveillance network of the Imperium military had noticed this meteorite. The Federal fleet had already calculated the falling trajectory of this meteorite 7 minutes ago. However, this meteorite fell on the Golan Highland on the side of the BG Plateau, which was far away from the Federal Forces garrison. The electromagnetic aftershocks after the earthquake seriously hindered the movement of the Air Force. On this barren land, 2 troops saw the meteorite falling from the sky from a viewing range of 40 kilometers. Then they did not have the time to appreciate this strange astronomical phenomenon. They both silently sped up their speed. The lone troops that left the valley in the middle of the night and headed towards the Golan Highland saw the trail of fire with their own eyes. Although they were exhausted and in extreme pain, they seemed to have swallowed a few large cups of stimulants. Their chest and abdomen burned, and their strength returned to their legs once again. A certain mecha battalion of the Federation that had retreated from the battle zone of the Straits and had continuously marched for 2 days looked at the dust and smoke stirred up by the meteorite falling from the sky. It was as if they could hear the passionate sound of war drums. The heavy mecha engine roared again. Half an hour later, both parties arrived at the place where the meteorite fell almost at the same time. The charred surface of the meteorite had already peeled off, revealing the metallic structure of the spaceship inside. The cabin door had already opened automatically, ready to welcome a group of escapees. The lone soldier climbed over a gentle slope with great difficulty, and stepped through thick bushes. When he saw this scene, he did not feel the slightest bit lucky that he had escaped alive, nor did he feel any ecstasy. This was because they saw 17 pure black Federation MX military mechas, under the leadership of a simple-looking but murderous mecha, had already climbed over the opposite mountain and appeared on the other side of the meteorite spaceship. The 18 Federation MX mechas formed a semicircular encirclement. The center of the encirclement was where the meteorite fell. On the other hand, the lone troops only had 7 or 8 people, more than 10 guns, 2 makeshift stretchers, and 1 broken mecha. The difference in strength between the two sides was too great. It was so great that there was no need to fight at all. At the edge of the bushes, the broken giant mecha shook its exaggerated but useless construction arm. It seemed to be greeting the Federation mechas, but also seemed to be surrendering. Xiong Lingquan held the heavy gun in his hand cautiously and looked at the imposing military mechas a few hundred meters away. Then, he silently looked at the back of the only broken mecha on his side. He raised his arm lightly and ordered his team members to carry the stretcher and retreat behind the bushes. In the mecha battle that was about to happen, they would not be of any use. Besides, last night, Sulu had promised them that he would deal with this situation. As Xiong Lingquan and the others retreated behind the bushes, the engines on the backs of the 17 Black MX mecha suddenly roared to life as they prepared to move. However, right at that moment, that battered assembled mecha smashed down with that thick construction arm. People had names, trees had shadows. Just like how the lone troops and those few Empire people had fallen into despair when they heard Madman Li's name, these Federation mecha were also abnormally nervous at this time. Following the movements of that broken mecha, they subconsciously stopped in their tracks and got into their most perfect and most extreme defensive positions. Although they were facing a broken assembled mecha, they were facing a broken assembled mecha. Chapter 918. Contrary to everyone's expectations, or rather the expectations of the alloy mecha, the gigantic, tattered, assembled mecha swung its exaggerated mechanical arm towards the ground, but it did not cause any landslides, nor did it cause any horrifying consequences. In fact, the crater it made on the ground was rather pitiful. That seemingly thick and strong mechanical arm had been broken into countless pieces by the recoil, looking exceptionally pitiful. They had been prepared to receive the strongest blow from the strongest opponent, only to see such a scene instead. They could not help but feel a little strange, a little ridiculous. After all, this was a makeshift mecha made up of countless discarded parts, so its structure was rather pitiful. However, even if it was just a bluff, it still managed to deter the ambush of those Federation MX mecha. After a slight delay, Xiong Lingquan and the others quickly retreated back into the bushes. The 17 Black MX mecha did not care about those fellows who were retreating from the battlefield. They only stared warily at the tattered mecha in the middle of the field that had already lost an arm and looked like a crippled beggar. They knew very well that with the mobility of those crippled soldiers, there was no way they could escape from the Golan Highlands. The only thing they needed to do was to defeat and destroy this tattered mecha in front of them and erase the powerful name in the cockpit of the mecha. Right then the tattered assembled mecha moved once more. The cockpit door slowly opened with an unpleasant creaking sound. The dim light of the morning shone in, revealing Su Li's ordinary but extraordinarily calm face. 200 meters away, the black mecha in the middle of the Federation's mecha group, which had a darker shade of black, popped out the exaggerated alloy blade at the front end of its right mechanical arm. The thick cockpit door opened, revealing Madman Li's face. His still delicate features held the same hint of madness and violence. After not seeing each other for 3 years, separated by 200 meters on the wasteland, Su Lu and Madman Li looked at each other from afar. They looked at the traces of timidity on each other's faces and remained silent for a long time. Who knew if it was because they had seen images from a long time ago? Just like Ka Chifeng on the old moon. The knife in his chest and the blood between his teeth in the Lin Yuan. The sound of gunfire in the mountains, and the words in the prison cell. One after the other, he ran wildly towards the blue sea. For a very long period of time, the two of them were publicly acknowledged as the strongest in the Federation. They had fought before, but they had never truly fought to the death. It was only when they met again, after 3 years on this bloody battlefield, that they finally reached the final moment. The cockpit door opened downwards, like a large door at the tail of a battleship, leading to the endless and deep universe. Sula looked at the meteorite ship nearby through this cross-section, and at the 10 or so Black Federation MX mecha in the distance. His gaze finally and naturally fell upon that mecha, upon Madman Li's face. "Duel?" Sula asked. His voice was not very loud, but it clearly penetrated the morning high ground and entered everyone's ears. "No way," Madman Li replied. His voice was just as proud and cold as before, like a ruthless blade that directly cut through all the messy reminiscences of old times. Hearing these 2 words that seemed to jump out from fiber paper, Su Li's thick eyebrows rose slightly. He looked quietly at him in the distance and said, "You won't even leave us a chance for a fair duel?" "I'm carrying out military duty, not a street brawl," Li Feng replied in a low voice. "You were also once a soldier of the Federation. You should understand very well that talking about fairness on the battlefield and calling it a duel is very childish thinking." Sula frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "The problem is that even you don't believe that you're carrying out military duty. If you say that you want to kill me because I'm a citizen of the Empire, then there's no reason for Big Bear and the others to be killed by you." "A soldier's duty is to obey orders," said Li Feng. Sula said mockingly, "What's the point of saying this? 3 years later, many people will laugh at me for becoming a third-rate philosopher. 3 years later, I don't want to laugh at you for becoming an ice demon like Du Shaoqing. When have you ever taken the military orders of your superiors seriously? I must bring everyone back." Li Feng's brows creased slightly. "If they are wronged, I guarantee that they will receive a fair trial." Sula looked at him like he was looking at a naive child. He smiled and said, "The Federation still has such a thing as fairness?" Li Feng loathed the way he looked at him. He laughed coldly and said, "Do you think that only the Empire can find fairness? No, there's no fairness in the Empire either. The Empire is a pile of dog shit." Sula calmly looked at that familiar face in the distance. After a short pause, he continued, "But you can't be willing to throw a pile of dog shit called the Federation in your face just because of this." Li Feng looked at that tattered mecha assembled together, and was silent for a long time. "As the grandson of the war god, you should understand the way our 17th Division does things, and you should also understand the way Team 7 does things. When we are insulted and harmed, we will not believe that any outsider can help us solve the problem. We only believe in ourselves," Sula said, "so don't count on them surrendering today." Li Feng's furrowed brows slowly relaxed. After a moment of silence, he looked at that face in the morning light and said, "Sula, I will give you a fair fight. If you lose, your people must give up resistance. I don't want this operation to become a one-sided massacre." Sula looked at him quietly, his left hand slowly and steadily sliding over the control stick. At this time, he did not have the simulation system. He was sitting on a tattered hybrid mecha that could collapse at any moment. The so-called fair fight with dignity was actually just bullshit. However, no one knew that under his calm expression, there was a smiling flower. Just as he had said to Xiong Lingquan last night, he understood Madman Li, so he could deal with Madman Li. The situation was progressing according to his plan. "And if I win?" he shouted in that direction. The most powerful MXD mecha against a tattered, assembled mecha. The difference in strength was too great. More importantly, the person operating the MXD mecha was Madman Li. Under these circumstances, even if War God Li Pifu was reborn, Feng Yu crossed the stars to come here, or Huai Chaoshi suddenly doubled in strength, they still would not be able to defeat the opponent. Thus, no one thought that Sula would win. Even Li Feng, who considered himself vigilant enough, did not think so himself. But strangely, due to some hidden worry in the depths of his heart, Madman Li replied seriously after a moment of silence, "If you win, I promise that those people behind the bushes will not be harmed in any way. But you must die." Very good, this is the promise I need, said Sulu with a smile. Only I really don't understand. Why do you want me to die regardless of the outcome? Whether as your uncle or uncle, you have no reason to hate me so much. There were only 3 MXD mecha in the entire Federation, and only 2 people in the entire Federation had the ability to operate a MXD mecha using turbo technology. Those 2 people were Su Lo and Madman Li. Su Li's little white flower was currently hiding in an unknown armory of the Federation, covered in dust. Meanwhile, the other MXD mecha with an even darker black had shone brilliantly on the Emohua planet for 3 years, fighting several battles with White Sausher's Peach Miasma, exceptionally valiant. Today, in the morning light of the Golan Highlands, the black MXD mecha was like a god of war. The alloy blade at the front of its right mechanical arm slowly lowered, pointing at its chest with an inexplicable fighting spirit. Then Li Feng's low and murderous voice came out. You named Little White Flower Lucio. You're such a sissy. I'm different. My mecha is called Beheading Joy. You should know the meaning of this name very well. Sula heard the indomitable interest in his voice, and his eyes slowly narrowed. The voice from the black MXD mecha continued. That year in the wilderness, I saved you from Du Shaoqing's gunpoint. At that time, you told me that you weren't from the Empire. And in the end, you were from the Empire. In Allure Prison, I watched over you for a few nights. I asked you if you were from the Empire, and you said no. In the end, you were from the Empire. After that, for 3 whole years, I stayed by Du Shaoqing's side. It was because I owed him a life of yours. I want to repay this life. But, as long as I don't kill you, this life of mine will never be completely repaid. 3 years ago, I was the one who saved your life, so I have the responsibility and obligation to let you die. Li Feng looked at the broken mecha, at the edge of the bushes in the distance expressionlessly, looking at the familiar yet strange face in the morning light. The vision at the edge of his eyelashes suddenly blurred. It was as if he saw the day of the riot in Allure Prison, when Huai Chaosher jumped out of the snow and chased after this small-eyed man for hundreds of miles. In the end, he chased him to the deep and blue sea. His mood gradually turned cold and violent, and he shouted in a low voice, I saw you jump into the sea. You should have died then. Why didn't you die? Do you think that I'll watch you, the Empire's crown prince, slip away from my eyes again? I'll stop you from thinking about it. Go to hell. As the 3 words roared out like 3 bombs, they smashed into the peaceful wasteland of the Golan Highlands. The black mecha's cockpit door closed with a whoosh, accompanied by the violent roar of the twin engines and the unique beeping sound of the turbocharger. The black MXD controlled by Li Feng suddenly turned into a black cannonball. It roared out, shattering the surrounding air, and blasted towards the broken mecha 200 meters away. There were no beautiful evasive maneuvers, nor were there any seductive stances. The killing intent that the black MXD had accumulated over the past 3 years was unleashed with this simple yet direct straight line. Its terrifying power was concentrated into a single point. The broken mecha also moved, sprinting down the gentle slope. However, the temporarily repaired mecha couldn't enter combat mode at all. The engineering mecha's wide tracks carried an extremely heavy body, crushing the wasteland. It looked as pitiful as the picture of an old cow pulling a broken cart in a prehistoric picture book. The straight black lines slammed into the huge body of the broken mecha, accompanied by the terrifying sound of metal tearing and heavy components colliding. In an instant, the outcome was clear. Under the violent slash of the black MXDs, more than 10 sharp blades, the broken mecha fell apart, turning into a desolate rain of metal pieces that fell to the ground with a clatter. No miracle happened. Maybe a miracle was going to happen. Chapter 919. Miracles were never bestowed by the Creator. Instead, they came from the never-withering determination and the best preparation in advance. Temporary failure was not scary. The real key was whether you were prepared for failure and tried to take advantage of it. The broken mech was instantly blasted into smithereens, turning into a black rain that filled the sky. This was not unexpected, including Su Lo in the cockpit. However, The spectators did not notice that there were actually many unnoticeable details hidden in this tragic one-sided battle. They did not notice his preparations. For example, the wide tracks had come off faster than expected. For example, the splashing of the thick armor had been more spectacular than the MXD blades. For example, when the assembled mecha had been cut in half at the waist, the faintly discernible rocket launchers had caused the upper half of the assembled mecha to topple over faster than expected. Because of the difference in speed, the scene suddenly became strange. The black MXD was like a violent woodcutter chopping down a heavy stone tree. The broken upper half of the tree seemed to have a pair of invisible legs. With a few muffled sounds, it broke away from the heavy alloy fragments that filled the sky and smashed towards the front right with a whoosh. On the right front, there were two Federation Mecha MX military mecha silently observing the battle. They watched as that half-section of the engineering mecha, weighing several dozen tons, came crashing down like a giant rock from outer space. However, they were unable to react in time, only able to watch and wait for the collision to happen. No one could react to this extremely strange move of Su Li's, except for Li Feng. The seemingly ruthless Mad Chop was, in fact, in an extremely cautious and calm state. He knew how difficult and powerful an enemy Su Li was. He knew that this person would definitely not be so stupid as to wait for death. Instead, he would have many strange tricks up his sleeve. For example, at this moment, with the help of the rocket launcher, the assembled mech had turned its heavy upper half into a primitive catapult. It intended to escape from the black MXD's range of control and take the risk to subdue the enemy. Since he was prepared, he naturally did not panic. When that half of the engineering mech swept horizontally towards the right like a supernatural scene, the black beheading happiness mech, under Li Feng's control, seemed to have a few more highly sensitive monitoring systems behind it. With a swoosh, it turned around, and the Darren's autocannon at the front of the mechanical arm opened fire. The high-density rain of bullets was tightly sealed within an area of 30 square centimeters, turning into an extremely lethal straight line that chased after half of the engineering mecha in the air. Bursting, countless white flowers blossomed. The heavy half of the engineering mech was hit by more than 100 large-caliber bullets. It could not jump more than 200 meters. As if it was struck by lightning, it fell heavily on the wasteland of the Golan Highlands with a dull thud. Dust and gravel splattered everywhere on the hard ground. The clumsy half of the mech rolled around in vain. The charred body of the mech was a mess. Electric sparks shone sorrowfully between the raised panels. The battle was not over yet. This was just the beginning. Just as that half of the engineering mech fell to the ground, a clear splashing sound once again came from the cockpit door. 12 miniature self-ejecting rocket pillars exploded at the same time, and the heavy cockpit door was pushed far away with a bang. Sula stepped on the edge of the cockpit and exerted force in his legs. Using the terrifying initial speed of the ejection, he swept out like lightning, avoiding the dense rain of bullets behind him. Like a thunderstorm, he charged more than 100 meters. Then, he turned around and gently landed on the target mech like a falling leaf. The Darren's autocannon at the front of the mechanical arm of the black beheading happiness mech suddenly stopped firing. This was because Su Lu, who was sticking to the mech like a falling leaf, was constantly climbing and jumping. It was very difficult to lock onto him. What was more troublesome was that if Li Feng tried to use the dense rain of bullets to kill him, then it was very likely that the mech he was in would also be destroyed at the same time. Bang! The Federation pilot in the cockpit of the Black MX mech immediately reacted. He understood the real reason why Colonel Li Feng had stopped attacking. His eyes widened as he operated the heavy mechanical arm to smash down on the cockpit door of the mech. Even though this action was very likely to lead to his death, he did not hesitate at all. The large and hard mechanical arm smashed heavily on the cockpit door. The alloy door was clearly deformed, and an ear-piercing screech of metal could be heard. Sula stepped on the crevice of the Area 41 armor and narrowly avoided the attack. His body rolled like a falling leaf as he climbed straight up the shoulder of the tall mech. The construction mechanical repair arm on his arm began to move quickly, buzzing and vibrating. The duck beak-shaped repair arm probed out, and removed the hidden plate behind the MX mech's shoulder. A high-speed rotating drill bit quickly disassembled the 6 positioning screws. The densely packed data cables were exposed before Su Li's eyes. His face was expressionless as he gripped them with his hand. Then he used some force to slide them down. The plastic sheet cracked, and the data cables were truly exposed, including the core lines inside. His steady palm continued to hold the exposed core lines. The scorching power behind his waist surged out, passing through his wrist, and instantly turning into a trickling stream under his subtle control. As those trickling streams passed through the core lines, they entered the MX mech's control hub. With a pleasant click, the cockpit door of the mech opened. Like a falling leaf, Su Li gently stuck to the black MX mech, removing the guard, removing the screws, melting the cable, and then successfully opening the cockpit door. In total, Su Li had completed 17 effective operations, all of which took less than 5 seconds. What was even more inconceivable was that while he was performing these operations, the black mech on his body had been trying to attack him without regard for mutual destruction. The heavy mech jumped and rolled madly on the wasteland like a lion, trying to shake off the annoying mouse on its body. Su Li was like a ship rolling endlessly at sea. Not only did he have to keep his footing, he also had to solve problems as quickly as possible. As the designer of the MX mecha, he knew all the minute details of this mecha, and even every hidden design. And this was still not enough. He still needed to be the best mechanic in the world, a fisherman with the strongest strength, a cracker with the calmest and thickest nerves, and most importantly, he still needed to have the ability to control the mecha using the human body. Only then would he be able to complete this impossible task. In all of history, only Feng Yu had ever performed such a shocking feat in the green hills of the Hushi region's outskirts in the Donglin region. Today, Su Li had finally done it. The cockpit door opened, and Su Li floated in like a leaf. The face of the Federation soldier in the dark-colored pilot's uniform was full of shock. He did not understand why the central control system would suddenly lose control, why the cockpit door would open at this moment, exposing himself to the enemy in the morning light and cold wind. Su Li grabbed his wrist like lightning and threw the pistol far away. Then, he used 3 fingers to press against the artery below the soldier's earlobe. Turning his head, he saw only darkness outside the cockpit door. As they watched him charge into the cockpit, more than 10 Federation MX mecha crazily surrounded him. The high-speed rotating Darlin's autocannons were aimed in the direction of the cockpit door, forming a scene like that of a sleeping forest. However, no one opened fire. In many of the Federation military's rumors, the former Colonel Su Li was already a character that was gradually becoming a legend. Today, after witnessing his legendary actions with their own eyes, these Federation soldiers were not only angry, but also in awe of him, not daring to act rashly. The group of black mecha parted to form a path, and the heavy Zhanshi MXD mecha slowly walked over. It walked directly to the front of the captured mecha, only stopping when it was less than 10 meters away. Accompanied by the faint sound of air splashing and the clicking of the self-balancing system, the cockpit door opened once again, revealing Li Feng's emotionless face. The two met again, and the distance between them was extremely close. The situation was also very different from before. Su Li now had an undamaged mecha and a hostage. Li Feng's left hand slowly moved away from the control stick, taking off half of the simulation system on his body. He stared coldly at the nearby Su Li, and said in an unprecedentedly serious tone, "You can't be so shameless. You're just forcing me to flip out." Su Li slowly placed his hand on the control stick, and the black MX mecha's Darlin's autocannons turned to aim at the cockpit door. The area covered by the rain of bullets included him and the Federation officer he was holding hostage. His expression was unusually calm as he replied, "In order to survive, I can do even more shameless things. As for flipping out, you should remember very clearly, even if it was Du Xiaoqing, I wouldn't give him any chance to flip out." Hearing his reply, Li Feng suddenly laughed. His delicate eyebrows trembled, his eyes abnormally bright, but an incomparably violent aura began to emanate from him. The smile did not fade, but it was exceptionally cold. Li Feng said coldly, "He's a soldier. I gave you a chance to fight fairly, so you shouldn't have ambushed him. Do you think I'll let you go just because you have a hostage?" As his voice fell, he pushed the control stick, and the left mechanical arm of the beheading Joy mecha abruptly shot out from behind. It accurately pierced through the gaps between the mecha, and aimed at the meteorite-like flying ship dozens of meters away, and fired fiercely. Bursts of explosions rang out. Li Feng, under the threat, did not make any concessions. He did not even say a single word to Su Le. He simply and violently destroyed that flying ship, cutting off all of the others' escape routes. Just now, Li Feng was a colonel in the Federation who was in charge of military affairs. Now Li Feng had officially become Madman Li. The Madman Li who was known for his ruthlessness, coldness, and strength. The terrifying Madman Li. Everyone in the Federation was afraid of Madman Li in this state, including the current deputy chairman of Xian, and all the other powerful figures. This was because once Madman Li went crazy, he would not listen to reason. Other than the words of war god Li Pifu and Zhong Shouhu, he would not listen to anyone. War god Li Pifu, and that fierce tiger in the West Woods, had become the eternal stars in the universe. Su Le seemed to be in a truly dangerous situation, but he was still calm and unafraid. This was because he had never been afraid of his opponent. Whether it was Lin Yuan, Kaki, or Qing Cheng, they had defeated the invincible Madman Li in the military, but they had never defeated him. Looking at the flying ship in the distance that had been blasted into pieces, Su Li's eyes slowly narrowed. His left hand gripped the pilot's throat, and he took a step forward. Facing the dozens of high-speed rotating Darlin's cannons, he walked to the edge of the cockpit door. He raised his left arm expressionlessly and suspended the pilot's body in midair. Then, he stared into Madman Li's eyes and began to vent his anger. Chapter 920. Do you think that I will be afraid of you, because you are unreasonable and violent? Madman Li, you probably forgot what kind of person I am. When there is a need, I will be even more unreasonable and violent than you, because at this moment, I am more righteous than you. You gave me a chance to fight fairly? Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the Federation mecha around him. Give me your MXD, and I will fight all of you alone. Is that fair? Don't forget that I designed these mechas. Is the Federation treating me so fairly? He looked around, and his nail-like gaze finally landed on Madman Li's cold face. He licked his dry lips and frowned. If you say that I don't have the right to be fair because I am from the Empire, then what about Team 7? When I went to the front lines, there were 137 people. Do you know how many people are left after 3 years, including this planet and the retired old men? Su Li's voice became light and tired. It was even more boring than the morning breeze in a foreign land. His neurotic lips moved slightly, and he said softly, 31 left. The rest are all dead. Just like those guys behind the bushes, they died mysteriously. The Golan Highlands fell into a short silence. The bushes around the mecha group trembled slightly. No one knew what had happened. Su Le stared at Madman Li's face, and suddenly raised his voice. No longer suppressing the anger that had been suppressed for days, he shouted harshly. Did the Federation's worst troops have such a high death rate? Did Du Xiaoqing send the 4 divisions to the Southwest War Zone? Did the Straits War Zone have any troops? If not, then tell me, what kind of fucking fairness is this? Madman Li raised his eyebrows slightly and said slowly, the people who died in Team 7 are paying the price for you. But they have no reason to. Su Le looked at him and replied mockingly, whether I am from the Empire or not has nothing to do with them. Just like how your father is a bastard. But I don't think you are a bastard, and I don't think you need to pay the price. Rebels, do you really believe the words of the general in the base? Do you believe the accusations of the higher-ups in the military? No, I know you don't believe me. Group 7 was brought up by me and Lao Bai. You know how amazing they are. Xiong Lingquan and the others were temporarily transferred to NTR before the war, and were sent to the Southwest War Zone. They were purposely forgotten, and tried to freeze to death in the enemy-occupied area. Then they valiantly survived and beautifully completed those damned missions. What was the result? In the end, they were hunted down by the federal military as rebels, when they were already in a desperate situation. You just said that I am shameless. Then I would like to ask, what is this? What was going on with the Federation? How did it become such a garbage dump? Madmanly, I was once a member of this army, but I never thought that in just 3 short years, this army would become a pile of dog shit. You didn't investigate these conspiracies, didn't investigate what happened under the plateau, and instead came here to hunt down your own comrades. What kind of dog shit have you become? Su Le stared at Madman Li's face and scolded him with the harsh and bitter tone that had disappeared for many years. He said mockingly, "After you and your father died, how could you have the face to see the old man?" Enough. Madman Li listened patiently, his eyebrows twitching from time to time. Finally, he could not help but interrupt his scolding and said slowly and coldly, "I have my eyes. I will go and see what happened. I will investigate what needs to be investigated. It is not up to you, the crown prince of the empire, to lecture me, but you must die. You have your eyes." Su Lu slowly released his left hand, so that the pale pilot could breathe some fresh air. He looked at Madman Li and said, "But the problem is that in this world, most of the people in the Federation are blind." Speaking of this, he seemed to have thought of something. He took a deep breath, paused for a moment, and continued calmly, "Actually, I have never thought about whether or not to return to the Federation, and when to return to the Federation, because there is a most troublesome problem that I have never been able to solve. But now I understand that these are just excuses. Those are excuses to convince yourself to escape, because no matter how troublesome the problem is, no matter how difficult it is to solve, you have to go and solve it. You have to take the first step. If you just hide in a corner and ponder in vain, that is the most boring fantasy. I will return to the Federation and soon." It was a very calm voice, a very indifferent narration. However, when he heard Su Lu say that he would return to the Federation soon, Madman Li's eyebrows seemed to have been stimulated. He suddenly raised them, and felt the murderous intent hidden in those calm words. It was extremely cold. He always remembered that 3 years ago, in that famous farewell letter, Su Lu had said, "Whether it is the government or the 7 great families, I want to see what you will turn the Federation into, and what you will turn yourself into. Do not try to hurt the people I want to protect, or else one day I will turn into a burning meteorite and fall from the sky, smashing all of your palaces and power into pieces." Was the people he wanted to protect the people in the silent march, the members of Group 7, who had silently died on the front lines? Or was it just those things he wanted to protect? Once Madman Li's eyebrows were raised, they could not be lowered again. He quietly looked at the small-eyed man standing on the cockpit door. He could vaguely see that stone from Donglin falling from the sky, dragging a long fiery tail as it smashed fiercely into the capital special district, into Parliament Mountain, into the official residence, and into the heads of those important figures who were unwilling to see flowing fire. Madman Li slowly forced out a few cold and suppressed words from between his teeth. "The Federation's matters will be handled by the people of the Federation. What is a person of the Empire, like you, going to the Federation for? You can say that I am cheap, but I still think of myself as a person of the Federation. Dozens of my closest brothers died on this bastard planet. In the past, I always pretended that I didn't know, but now I can no longer continue pretending, so I can only go back." Su Le looked at him calmly. Suddenly, the corners of his lips curled up, revealing a mouth full of neat white teeth. He said, "Go back for what? The first thing, of course, is to kill your biological father." Suddenly, he took a step back into the dim cockpit. His left hand was still cautiously and vigilantly holding the pilot's body, blocking in front of his body. His heel slowly stepped on a button somewhere. "Now let's make things simpler. This is a personal grudge, and it doesn't involve anything else. Regarding these matters, you have your own eyes, so I will be my eyes." Su Lu raised his right hand, pointed 2 fingers at his eyes, and said, "Distinguish between black and white." Madman Li slowly tilted his neck, and looked at him from the side of the frame. Half of his body was immersed in the darkness of the cockpit. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "Can the eyes of the dead also distinguish between black and white? After I die, I will also dig out my eyeballs and soak them in formaldehyde water to see how Pabre and your father will die." Sula stepped on the protruding button beside his foot and said, "And I won't die so easily." As Su Li's foot stepped on that button, the situation suddenly changed. The black MX mech began to tremble violently. Amidst the continuous popping sounds, more than a dozen precision rocket thrusters were fully activated. The powerful reaction force caused the entire cockpit to instantly separate from the body. Like a perfectly round metal shell, it whistled and shot diagonally into the sky above the wasteland. Almost at the same time, a loud roar came from the bushes hundreds of meters away that had been silent for too long. A dark-colored spaceship covered in optically absorbent material flew diagonally under the propulsion of a powerful engine. The 10 or so Federation MX mechas were completely unable to react at all. They could only watch as the cockpit that had been ejected, and the spaceship, that had been hidden behind the bushes at some point in time, completed an incredibly precise mid-air capture maneuver in mid-air. Then, it turned into a conspicuous line that tore through the blue morning sky, whistling away from the Golan Heights at high speed and flying out of the atmosphere. Perhaps it was July, but there was more than one meteor in the sky. Through precise calculations and the combination of materials, Philip had sent 2 air-to-ground transfer spaceships to the Golan Heights at once. The spaceship that was dragging Huawei was only a target used to attract the Federation's attention. The spaceship that was actually used to pick up people silently landed behind the bushes. When Su Lu was facing off against Madman Li and the 17 Federation mecha in the wasteland, Xiong Lingquan and the others had already carried the stretcher and quietly boarded the spaceship. In order to prevent Lunatic Li from noticing the commotion on the other side, Su Lu had to stay on the field and perform a total of 3 precise and perfect ejection moves. His unbelievable mecha control allowed him to complete this move, and in the end, he was able to climb high and retreat gracefully. Su Lu and the old man were invincible. Madman Li silently looked at the spaceship that was disappearing into the horizon. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. He muttered to himself in a low voice, 3 ejections. You're still so strong. But who can distinguish between black and white? The surrounding cockpits opened one by one. The pilot that was held hostage by Su Lu was also rescued. In the last moment before the cockpit was ejected, this pilot was thrown out. After a short period of unconsciousness, he woke up. His life wasn't in any danger. The morning breeze brushed past. More than 10 black mecha were looking at the eastern sky. These were the most outstanding soldiers of the Federation. Their faces were filled with resentment and anger. They cursed Su Li's shamelessness and cunning angrily. And then they looked at the beheading Happiness mecha with complicated expressions. As members of the core mecha camp directly under Madman Li, they knew very well what kind of strength their colonel possessed. Thus, at this moment, they were somewhat puzzled and confused. Why didn't their colonel do anything when the cockpit was ejected at the last moment? Yes, during the process of the last cockpit being ejected, with Madman Li's strong mecha control skills, he definitely had the time and opportunity to stop or knock down the cockpit. However, for some unknown reason in the end he didn't do anything. Perhaps it was because of Su Li's last sentence. He said he wanted to go back to the Federation to kill my father. Madman Li lit a cigarette and said expressionlessly, I feel that this matter can be done. I'm too embarrassed to do it myself. So someone has to do it. Chapter 921. There was a saying in the Federation that the thinner the lips, the colder and more ruthless the temperament of a person. This saying was hard to prove with Su Li's attitude on the surface, but when probed into the depths of his heart, it vaguely made sense. On the other hand, Madman Li was the opposite. He was the youngest colonel in the Federation with thin lips. If he hadn't been willing to silently protect Du Shaoqing for 3 years, he might have already become the youngest general in the history of the Federation. In the eyes of many people, He had a ruthless and cold temperament. As he watched the spaceship leave, he could coldly discuss how his own father was about to be hunted down by someone like Su Le. In reality, however, not many people could touch the true fire in his ruthless body. The military vehicle driving towards the base shook uneasily. The cigarette swayed uneasily between his thin lips. From time to time, he would flick out a few wisps of smoke, smearing the glass for a moment before disappearing without a trace. Just like the thoughts that were rapidly flashing through his mind at this moment. Before Du Shaoqing was transferred back to the capital ring, he had a long conversation with him in the battlefield graveyard. During the conversation, the Federation General's greatest concern wasn't the war situation on planet Emohua after he left, but the internal problems of the Federation forces. The political atmosphere of the Federation, especially the capital special district's political atmosphere, had long been corrupted. The infamous Joint Investigation Department had long wanted to extend their tentacles into the front lines outside the space channel, but they didn't dare make a move due to Du Shaoqing's power and influence. Du Shaoqing was worried that after he left, no one would suppress the Joint Investigation Department, which had extremely high authority. He was worried that those filthy political conflicts would invade the forces. So he secretly instructed Li Feng to closely observe, pay attention, or guard against such anomalies. This seemingly difficult task was very simple for Li Feng, because he was the grandson of the Lis of Philadelphia, the son of Chairman Li Jiedu, and everyone knew that the man behind the dark curtain was none other than Li Jiedu. As per Du Shaoqing's instructions, Li Feng had been keeping a vigilant eye on the 17th Division. Even after being sent to the Straits to take charge of the battle, he had not forgotten about this matter. When he confirmed that the new 17th Division would not be going to the front lines, and that the upper echelons of the military and the investigation department probably did not do anything, he relaxed. Then, at the end of the continuous battle, he was somewhat shocked and angry to receive news that the NTR team of the new 17th Division had defected. This was an accident. If Da Vinci had obediently accepted the investigation and not chosen to fire back, then none of the subsequent events would have happened. In a dark room in the headquarters deep in the base, General Hu Lian, the commander-in-chief of the federal military, looked at the young officer in front of him. After a moment of silence, he continued to explain, "You should be very clear about the whole process of the matter. According to the on-site investigation and testimony, the shooting incident could have been an accident, or it could have been a cold-blooded murder by Leonardo da Vinci and others." General Hu Lian was the highest-ranking officer on the front lines. He had the highest authority and authority. Logically speaking, there was no need for him to explain these things to a colonel. However, because of the other party's special identity and the ruthless aura hidden under his calm expression, he had to explain. Li Feng's thin lips slightly opened. There was no emotion in his voice. An accident and murder are two completely different concepts. But in the end, people died. General Hu Lian looked into his eyes and rubbed his forehead. He said in a low voice, "Small Eyes combat team and reconnaissance team died. There were also people in the NTR second camp of the 17th Division. And then Leonardo da Vinci fled. Deserters and defectors are still two completely different concepts." The young officer's voice was still calm. No matter how hard the general tried to discern his true intentions, he was unable to do so. General Hu Lian's expression gradually became serious. He frowned and stared at his face. After a long silence, he said, "Everyone in the army knows the temper of the bandits in Old Seven's group. Do you remember how Magnolia cut off Dongfang's ear 3 years ago? If Xiong Lingquan and the others knew about this shooting incident, how would they react? They would definitely act recklessly. I am the commander. I have to consider the entire situation on the front lines. I can't put my mind on such a small matter. I have to consider the stability of the entire army. In order to eliminate all unstable factors, in order to prevent Xiong Lingquan and the others from acting recklessly, the base decided to act recklessly and pin the crime of defection on them." Li Feng slowly frowned and looked at the general behind the table. General Hu Lian was silent for a long time before he replied, They acted together with the Crown Prince and the soldiers of the Empire. They even launched 3 attacks on the federal forces. The headquarters has sufficient evidence to prove that they have betrayed the Federation. Li Feng tightly pursed his thin lips and looked at him in silence for a long time. General Hu Lian looked at him and said sincerely, "There will be no record of our conversation today. I didn't admit to anything just now, but I must remind you that the capital ring is very chaotic right now. Mr. President and Chairman Li are under too much pressure. The front lines cannot be messed up." Little Feng, no matter what conflicts you have with Chairman Li, you are still the descendant of the Lis of Philadelphia. You should consciously protect the legitimacy of the federal forces. In my opinion, those bandits have no right to stay in the federal forces, much less the glorious 17th Division. Li Feng slowly stood up and seriously fastened the collar around his neck. He looked at the military boss behind the table and said in a deep voice, "I am indeed a member of the Lis of Philadelphia, but General, you forgot one thing. As a soldier of the Federation, my grandfather would never treat any federal forces, including the 17th Division, as his private army. If that father of mine has expressed similar intentions to you, I can only say that to this day, he probably still doesn't understand why my grandfather retired to the lakeside. I can only say that he has no right to wear this military uniform." Li Feng stood up straight in his dark military uniform. With a clap, he saluted expressionlessly like a sword about to be unsheathed. General Hu Lian looked at him and squeezed out a strained smile, saying, "You fought well in the Battle of the Straits. You should rest early. I will ask for a reward for you. The next time we meet, you should have an extra star on your shoulder. I have never needed to rely on a general's star to prove my accomplishments. My mecha's mechanical legs are already painted with countless stars." Li Feng slowly put down his right hand and said in a deep voice, "Since you insist on the legitimacy of the federal forces, and insist that the 17th Division is an army of the Lis of Philadelphia and cannot tolerate any scum, then no matter the reward, please hand over the new 17th Division to me. He has already been suspended. I will sign the order immediately," said Hu Lian. Li Feng walked towards the door of the office, but he suddenly stopped at the doorstep and said, "Since from now on, the new 17th Division is my unit, then I hope that Sir General will be able to transfer the 3 mechanics around our encampment away as soon as possible. With my unit being blocked in an alley, I will not be in a good mood. I will not be in a good mood. I will not let others be in a good mood." The armored military vehicle roared as it drove out of the forward operating base, rushing toward the area where the new 17th Division was stationed. Li Feng lit up another cigarette, causing the cigarette and his tall and strong body to sway uneasily at the same time. His slightly furrowed brows contained a storm. He sat in the front passenger seat, with a few officers in the back. These officers were the assistants or supervisors that War Godly Pifu had specially chosen for him after he had caused a ruckus on Parliament Hill and smashed Senator Zion's office. Many years had passed in a flash. These officers had followed him through the West Woods and entered the Empire. Their loyalty and ability were unquestionable. Feeling the strangely oppressive atmosphere in the car, no one spoke. One of the staff officers had been staring at the screen on the workbench on his knees, and no one knew what he saw. He waved his arm vigorously, and then quickly reported to the front. "The letter of appointment has been filed. You are officially the acting commander of the new 17th Division." "What about the 3 mechanics around the 17th Division?" asked Li Feng expressionlessly. "The defense order has been issued. According to the time calculation, they would have already evacuated when we arrived," replied the staff officer. Li Feng shook his head and threw the cigarette in his hand out of the window. He said, "Other than being good at defense, Hu Lian's most famous skill is to flatter my father. For him to hand over the 17th Division to me so quickly means that the rumors are true, but I wonder if in a few more hours, he will regret handing over the authority too quickly." In the shaking military vehicle, the staff officers looked at each other. Although they did not speak, they could see the excitement in each other's eyes. They knew very well that the calmer the young acting commander in the front passenger seat was, the crazier he would be. Get me a copy of all the orders and records of the NTR unit immediately. Look for old Luo in the headquarters for this matter. Top secret document. His authority level is not enough. Just say that I want it. If anything happens, I will take responsibility for him. Even if it is the Bureau of Proclamation. Yes. Also, Li Feng frowned slightly. Thinking of Su Li's words before he left, he said, investigate what exactly happened with the earthquake at the BG Plateau. A battered military vehicle drove into the military camp in the desolate twilight. Smoke and dust could be faintly seen in the distance. It was probably the movement of the 3 fully equipped mechanics. The scene of hundreds of mechas activating at the same time. Although it was not in front of one's eyes, one could imagine how magnificent it would be. His military boots stomped heavily on the ground. Madman Li walked out of the military vehicle. There was no emotion on his face, only a violent rage that was almost impossible to suppress. On the way, he had already obtained all the secret records and completely understood the so-called rebel army's command and pursuit. So he no longer hid his true emotions. He did not care to hide them. Get out! Get out! Get out! The young acting commander's burly body burst into the military camp. The military police who were ordered to monitor the 17th Division were directly blown away by a series of thunderous roars. Walking into the new 17th Division headquarters, the first thing Madman Li did was to stop He Lei's confinement. Then, he gathered all the officers of the new 17th Division, above the rank of colonel, for an impromptu meeting. My name is Li Feng. From today onwards, I will be the acting commander of the new 17th Division. Chapter 922. This was Madman Li's opening speech as the new commander of the 17th Division. For an outsider to declare his ownership of an ace division of the Federation, he seemed so righteous and rude. Hua Xiaoxi, Amy, and the other officers of the 17th Division looked at each other silently. But even with their arrogance, they did not raise any objections. Just as Hu Lian had said, in the eyes of everyone in the Federation military, the 17th Division was born with the surname Li. History and tradition began with the military god Li Pifu. After the reorganization, the new commander, Yu Qinghai, was Li Pifu's chef. In the past, the candidate for commander had been Su Lu, who was personally chosen by Li Pifu. Until today, the grandson of the Lis of Philadelphia had finally made his debut. It's not so easy to be the commander of the 17th Division. Madman Li looked at He Lei expressionlessly and said in a low voice, my grandfather can do it, so can old Commander Yu. If Su Lu is not from the Empire, so can I. But you can't. Do you know why? Because you can't be like my grandfather, flying a broken mecha for 1,000 miles, and killing the Emperor of the Empire. You can't be like Commander Yu, flying into a rage at the general my father sent to interrogate you all, like an old rabbit protecting its cub, ready to bite at any moment, daring to call Du Xiaoqing a pretty boy to his face. You can't be like Su Lu, foolishly flying a 3-wing battleship through the space channel to chase after an Empire fleet. To become a true member of the 17th Division. Madman Li looked around at the officers in the room, and his gaze finally landed on He Lei's face. He said sternly, to be the commander of the 17th Division, you have to be more ruthless than anyone else. He Lei's expression was very complicated. As the former acting commander, he had just come out of confinement when he was mercilessly scolded by the current acting commander. Moreover, the other's rank was the same as his, but he was much younger than him. Who could accept this? But at this time, the person lecturing with a sullen face was Madman Li. He had joined the army at the age of 12, and his mecha had produced countless legendary battle results. He had enough experience and background to scold these originally proud and powerful officers in the room. Lin Ai sat in the corner. He quietly listened to the first lecture of this acting teacher. He felt that there was something different between the lines. It was as if he was deliberately provoking a certain emotion in everyone, causing the atmosphere in the room to become irritable. This, Young Commander Lee. He took off his military cap, rubbed his bald head, and asked seriously, I want to ask, under the current circumstances, what should the 17th Division do to be considered ruthless? The officers of the 17th Division in the room all knew very well that the so-called current circumstances referred to the NTR unit of their division being ordered to carry out the most difficult mission, and then being framed as a traitor by the upper echelons of the military. Under the pressure of the Federation's investigation department and the pursuit of the Small-Eyed Combat Department, they had suffered heavy casualties, but they could do nothing about it. Madman Lee did not answer his question. His eyes were downcast as he said indifferently, the mecha unit under my command has already been handed over. I want to know where the mecha of the 17th Division are now, what their condition is, and whether they can fight. Other than the engineering-related mecha, our division has a total of 144 MX model military mecha, all in camp. The mecha group is in good condition, and their self-test frequency has not decreased. They are ready for battle at any time, but Commander. The new 17th Division mecha manager, Hua Xiaoxi, stood up to report. As time passed, his voice grew more and more excited, but also somewhat doubtful. He had vaguely guessed something, but did not dare to believe it. He asked in a trembling voice, where are we going to fight? As soldiers of the Federation, wherever the enemy is, we will go to fight. Madman Lee said a phrase very similar to Group 7's famous saying, and after a short pause he continued, whether those enemies are outside or inside the army. Hearing this, the officers of the 17th Division in the room finally understood what he wanted to do. The expressions on their faces fluctuated between shock and doubt, excitement and hesitation, and in the end, they were all replaced by an iron-blooded ruthlessness. All the officers, including He Lei, pushed back their chairs and stood up. With a clap, they stood at attention and saluted the acting commander behind the desk. Although they remained silent, their attitude was already clear. Acting Commander Li Feng, who had just entered the 17th Division's camp less than half an hour ago, led his subordinates in dozens of bulletproof military vehicles, leaving the camp in a cloud of dust. The convoy's destination was the base, where the Federal Military Headquarters was located. The black explosion-proof tires rotated at high speed, letting out ear-piercing screeches from time to time. The stones in the field were crushed and sent flying in all directions, and the soft soil was thrown everywhere. Dozens of Federation military vehicles roared forward at the same time, dragging countless black and yellow tails behind them. It was an exceptionally majestic sight, and the momentum was astonishing. The base war zone had been completely controlled by the Federation 3 years ago. Within an area of several thousand square kilometers, there were 17 Federation ground troops stationed, and the total number of soldiers exceeded 200,000. Although there was no need to closely monitor the rear of the base, this shocking convoy still alerted the sentries of the various troops at first notice. The reorganized Mechanic Division, the new Armored Division, the Rapid Reaction Brigade, and the various troops all tried to do something after receiving the information, but when those generals with outstanding military achievements confirmed that the convoy came from the new 17th Division base, and that Madman Lee was sitting in the military vehicle at the very front, they immediately understood what the new 17th Division wanted to do. After a moment of silence, they restrained their troops and entered a strange period of silence. It was impossible for the Federation headquarters in the base to remain silent. Lieutenant General Hu Lian's forcefully suppressed cold voice rang out in the vehicle system. Little Feng, you want to start a mutiny right after taking office? This is fucking nonsense. Go back immediately. Madman Lee looked at the base lugs in the distance and replied expressionlessly, Commander, if the 17th Division really wants to mutiny, there will be more than just a few dozen military vehicles here. Lieutenant General Hu Lian roared angrily. A few dozen military vehicles? Don't think that you can hide from the eyes of the headquarters, just because you have an old friend in the General Staff Department. The Bureau of Proclamation just sent out an emergency report, and the Federation has detected that the 17th Division's mecha have been activated, and are on the way. What are you trying to do? Is there something wrong with your brain? Madman Li's delicate eyebrows slowly furrowed. He really did not expect that the tattered charter network of planet Mohua would be able to notice his deployment so quickly. After a moment of silence, he calmly replied, Commander, as the acting commander of the 17th Division, I will be leading my division's internal affairs department to the forward base to investigate some officers who are suspected of collaborating with the enemy. In order to prevent any resistance, I have ordered the mecha group to be activated. Please understand. Lieutenant General Hu Lian angrily rebuked. Bullshit. What authority does a division's internal affairs department have to investigate a case? Or are you saying that you, as a division commander, want to overthrow the headquarters? You misunderstand. The vehicle was shaking, but Madman Li's face did not tremble at all. He replied in a low voice, The front lines need stability, and the troops need stability. I don't have any thoughts about the headquarters, but since I am the commander of the 17th Division, there are some things that I need to express. Don't forget your identity. You are a soldier of the Federation, and a soldier's duty is to obey orders. If you don't withdraw immediately, I will arrest you for attempted mutiny. Madman Li very succinctly replied with 2 words. Welcome. After a moment of silence on the other end of the communication system, Lieutenant General Hu Lian's somewhat tired voice rang out again. This is the front lines. Your attitude will make the entire situation uncontrollable. Little Feng, you should know very well what it means to have the Empire's people watching us from the north. If the base is in chaos, what it means? It is precisely because the Empire's people are watching us from the north that I must first remove the abscesses in the base. Otherwise, the soldiers fighting on the front lines will have to constantly be on guard against a cold shot from behind. How will this battle continue? This is a mutiny. Lieutenant General Hu Lian was clearly enraged by the convoy that the new 17th Division had sent out. He heavily slammed the table and roared angrily, Even you can't bear this responsibility. Madman Li slightly raised his eyebrows and said with a bit of mockery, The responsibility of a mutiny on the front lines is great. I am only a temporary division commander, and you are the commander. You must bear this responsibility. Li Feng, you really are a madman. The convoy began to slow down, and the smoke outside the window gradually settled down. Madman Li's raised eyebrows slowly calmed down, and he calmly replied, Everyone knows that. Without waiting for the other side of the communication system to ask again, he ended the communication. Staring at the nonstop beeping of the communication system, the livid Lieutenant General, Hu Lian's lips twitched slightly. He asked with a hoarse voice, Have they boarded the ship? Director Barry and the Federation Investigation Department officials haven't had time to board the ship. The staff officer behind the general nervously replied, The scheduled landing time has passed, and the spaceship hasn't arrived at the base yet. The 17th Division headquarters once had a secret communication with the Federal Fleet. I don't know if this has anything to do with it. Lieutenant General Hu Lian placed both hands on the table, his shoulders slightly trembling. After a long period of silence, he ordered with a tired voice, Suspend the defense of the base, and withdraw all ground forces from Area Y3. As for the Federation Investigation Department, just inform them. The staff officer looked at him in shock, and then immediately sobered up. He understood that the general had finally chosen to retreat and betray the enemy when faced with the madness of Little Division Commander Li. The gates of the base were opened wide to welcome the guests. The various heavy weapons hidden in the corners were silent and quiet like the girls in a nightclub. Facing the dozens of new 17th Division military vehicles that roared in, they were incomparably reserved and shy, not making any active reactions. The new 17th Division fleet roared into the base, and then accompanied by the sharp screech of brakes, they surrounded Area Y3 where the Joint Investigation Department was located. More than 100 fully armed soldiers pushed open the doors and alighted, raising the guns in their hands with murderous intent. After the Joint Investigation Department received the information, under the forceful orders of the base headquarters, They prepared to leave in a somewhat sorry state. However, for some reason, the warship in charge of transport still hadn't arrived. This was their misfortune, but also their fortune. Because right now, in Area Y3, the Small Eyes special forces that belonged to them had already gathered. These Federation's most powerful special forces numbered no less than 300 people. The strength comparison was very good. Director Barry looked at the other side with a gloomy expression and began to prepare a lecture to seize the other side's courage. Then, he would painfully explain the situation to facilitate negotiations. With a muffled bang, the doors were slammed shut. Li Feng slowly walked to the center of the field, facing the 300 Federation's most elite special forces, and said with an expressionless face, "There is no negotiation, only surrender." Chapter 923. The most powerful secret force against the most elite army soldiers, with the newest guns in their hands, seemed to be in a tense confrontation, but everyone knew who had the upper hand. The new 17th Division was the trump card of the Federation, but the Small-Eyed Force was known as the most powerful special force of the Federation government. Countless bloody facts in the past 3 years had long proven this point. More than 100 ordinary soldiers of the new 17th Division wanted to take the guns of 300 Small-Eyed Special Force soldiers. No matter how you looked at it, it was impossible. But it was precisely in such a situation that Madman Li walked out of the military vehicle and was too lazy to say anything. He said that there was no room for doubt. It seemed stupid and arrogant, but in fact, it was more of a contempt that originated from powerful strength. The elite special forces of the Small-Eyed unit stared at the young colonel, who had delicate features, but gave off a strong sense of oppression. They gripped the automatic guns in their hands tightly and frowned. They did not surrender. Instead, they raised the muzzles of their guns a little because of a strong sense of danger. The situation was urgent, and it was on the verge of breaking out. It was the appearance of some officials urgently needed. Director Bailey, who had just squeezed out an angry expression to hide the panic in his heart, saw the reaction of his subordinates and calmed down a little. He lightly coughed twice and coldly reprimanded, "Colonel, I order you to immediately withdraw your troops, or the Joint Investigation Department will arrest you with third-level authority." Madman Li did not even look at him. He still looked at the black mass of Special Force soldiers in front of him with a blank face. His eyes swept across their military uniforms and the eye-catching blood-red small eye emblem on the left arm of the military uniform. After a moment of silence, he reprimanded with a slightly mocking tone, "You are not soldiers. What qualifications do you have to be here at the front line? Do you think you can become a soldier by wearing a turtle robe?" The fat on the tip of Director Bailey's eyebrows faintly twitched. In addition to the anger of being ignored, he was more puzzled. As a senior official who was transferred from the Bureau of Proclamation to the Joint Investigation Department, he only needed to answer to the President and Chairman Li Jiedu. He had a very high authority. He did not believe that the crazy people of the new 17th Division would dare to mess around in front of thousands of people, let alone hurt him. Yes, he admitted that he was indeed very afraid of Madman Li, but he firmly believed that even someone as crazy as this person would not dare to bear the crime of harming the Joint Investigation Department, because that would mean going against the Federation, which was equivalent to a mutiny or even a rebellion. Since that was the case, the new 17th Division seemed to have charged into the base with a murderous aura. But it was nothing more than trying to regain some glory. It was nothing more than Colonel Li Feng's new acting division commander trying to win the hearts of the soldiers, forcing the Joint Investigation Department to apologize and make a few symbolic concessions. Director Bailey firmly believed that his judgment was wise and correct, so he couldn't understand why these people were ignoring him. Even if they didn't want to negotiate for the sake of acting cool, how could he lower his head if he didn't negotiate? Madman Li still ignored him. His eyebrows were like a wildfire that was about to burn. He stared at the 300 most powerful Special Forces soldiers of the Federation in front of him and said, "I know you guys are from Philadelphia and think that you are the best fighters in the world, so you are used to being arrogant. He suddenly raised his voice and spat out like a violent flame. "But in front of me, none of you have the right to be arrogant. I've been to all of your training halls and beaten up all of your masters. Before I, Wada, die, you bunch of trash from Philadelphia better not put the name of Philadelphia on your heads. The purpose of forming this unit is to kill Su Le. More than 300 people have chased after him for 3 years. But you couldn't even cut off a single hair on his head. Before that small-eyed man dies, what right do you have to be arrogant? No matter how arrogant you are still trash after all." The more than 300 soldiers of the small-eyed special forces suddenly changed their expressions. Some of them finally recognized the identity of this ruthless young division commander in front of them and remembered the past in Philadelphia many years ago. They remembered the 12-year-old boy who humiliated all the training halls in Philadelphia. If it were any other time, when this group of powerful special forces from Philadelphia were humiliated like this, they would definitely throw away all the restraints of discipline and use their blood to regain their honor. However, it was impossible for them to do so today, because they were also facing people from Philadelphia. The back mountain of Feiqing City was the place where the essence of the Federation had been gathered for hundreds of years. The people there worshipped martial arts and were tough and aggressive. The dozens of training halls had cultivated many strong people like Kong Wu for the big families and powerful government agencies. However, the real reason why Feiqing City was famous and feared by the world was because of that old man, the family name that hung above Feiqing City like a crown. "My surname is Li. I am Madman Li." The 300 soldiers with guns lowered their heads in respect. Some of the small-eyed special forces quietly placed their guns beside their feet. Scattered sounds of metal clashing sounded in the field. Although some of the soldiers were still holding their guns nervously and waiting for orders from their superiors, no one dared to look directly into Madman Li's eyes anymore. A person with empty hands was able to defeat the resistance of a group of fierce special forces soldiers with just his name. Other than the godlike influence of his family in Philadelphia, it was also because of his tyrannical and ruthless personality that had long become a legend. Who else could have such an intimidating presence other than him? At this moment, the heavy sound of rolling tracks suddenly sounded around the Y3 area of the base, mixed with the clear sound of hydraulic jumping. Dozens of black MX mechas solemnly entered the area and immediately took control of the situation. If the new 17th Division had shown up first to intimidate them, the small-eyed special forces would have had no choice but to surrender in the end. However, no one could say for sure whether or not there would be any bloodshed due to some unforeseen circumstances. Therefore, in Madman Li's plan, he had decided to show up first by himself to intimidate everyone and minimize the possibility of bloodshed. Director Bailey had been watching everything with a frown on his face. No one had paid him any attention, so he had the opportunity to analyze the situation. He accurately guessed Madman Li's thoughts, but for some reason, he just couldn't relax. The new 17th Division didn't want to cause bloodshed, but why did he still feel so strange? Director Bailey couldn't understand. He watched as the new 17th Division soldiers walked into the crowd and began to disarm. He felt a strange cold wind blowing between his eyebrows and ears, and he began to smell some sort of danger. If the new 17th Division finished disarming, then the entire small-eyed special forces, or more accurately, the officers of the Joint Investigation Department, would no longer have any power to protect themselves. They could only become shivering white rabbits, waiting to be skinned alive or cut into 13 pieces and braised behind the back of HDD Bureau. Director Bailey's breathing quickened. He couldn't just watch the situation develop like this. In order to stop the other from disarming, he gathered his courage and looked at Madman Li angrily. "I'm going to report you to the Federation government. Madman Li, you must be severely punished by military law. Chairman Madman Li will not let you get away with this." By bringing up Li Jiedu's name, he didn't expect to be able to suppress someone like Madman Li, even though the two were father and son. He only hoped that the soldiers of the small-eyed special forces would wake up and remember that Chairman Li Jiedu was this person's father. He hoped that they would regain the will to fight even if it was just the courage to hold a gun. However, he misjudged the status of the Lees of Philadelphia. The people of Philadelphia respected and were willing to obey Chairman Lee Jae-do largely because he was the only son of the war god. For them, the only ones who could truly represent the Lees of Philadelphia were the grandfather and grandson. Madman Lee finally slowly turned his head to look at Director Bailey. He knew this person's fear and thoughts. In order to let his subordinates complete the disarming work, he didn't mind deigning to say a few words to this person. The complaint is invalid because this is the front line, not the Capitol Ring, and not a rotten house like Parliament Hill or the official residence. As for military law, only the soldiers can speak for themselves. He looked at Director Bailey and said expressionlessly, "It seems that you know very well what kind of land you are standing on. Then you should understand that it is more dangerous for you to stir up trouble on the front line than to play tricks behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, you frame people and extort confessions through torture. Perhaps 2 or 3 opponents will plead guilty and be framed to death because of this. But in a place like the front line, what you do will put thousands of people in danger." Madman Lee's conclusion was, "So people like you should never appear on the front line, in the army." There was a cold, murderous intent hidden in the calm words. Director Bailey felt his body getting colder and colder, as if there was a layer of frost between his eyebrows and eyelashes. For some reason, his voice became unusually hoarse and slightly trembling as he said, "If there is any violation of the rules of the Joint Investigation Department, I am willing to accept questioning and investigation under the framework of the Joint Staff Committee. If Commander Lee agrees, I am willing to surrender to the military police headquarters and take the responsibility." The officers of the Joint Investigation Department behind him looked over in astonishment. They didn't know why the director suddenly became mentally ill and actually said that he would take responsibility. As a high-ranking department of the Federation government, any case they investigated was in accordance with the charter. What responsibility was there to talk about? Director Bailey didn't explain anything to his subordinates. He waved his hand and signaled for all the officers to leave with him. He would rather admit to framing the NTR unit of the new 17th Division than stay in front of Madman Lee for another 2 seconds. This is a very clever man. Unfortunately, he used all his cleverness to frame the dark curtain. Madman Lee silently thought as he looked at Bailey's back. He suddenly frowned and smiled somewhat strangely. He took the pistol from the staff officer beside him and inserted it into his belt. He said, "Who allowed you to leave?" Director Bailey's body stiffened and he stopped. Madman Lee said, "I said that people like you should never appear in the army and appear on the front line. I am very happy to see you accept the investigation, but I am more concerned about how to guarantee the word forever. What in this world could be called forever? Other than time, there was only death." Young Commander Lee thought so. Chapter 924. He walked forward and took out a piece of paper from his left breast pocket. Facing the handwriting on it, he read, "Mu Fei, Lu Yuqing Neo Fan Yong. Those who have been named will stay for investigation. The rest of the members of Small Eye's combat unit must leave the planet's surface in half an hour." He looked past Madman Lee's steel-like shoulder and looked at the gray sky. He nodded slightly and said, "The fleet's support ship is about to land." The Joint Investigation Department had 9 names named and asked to stay. Other than Director Bailey, there were 6 senior investigation officers and 2 commanders of Small Eye Special Forces. These people had all participated in the investigation of the NTR unit of the new 17th Division and directly planned that cold-blooded and shameless framing. The new 17th Division did not accept Director Bailey's request to turn himself into the military police headquarters. Instead, they demanded that they stay and accept their own investigation. Some of the hidden meanings gradually became clear, and the officers of the Joint Investigation Department finally understood why Director Bailey had acted like that before. A dangerous atmosphere permeated the field, flowing slowly and seeping along the edges of the cold steel mecha and guns. as if it wanted to freeze all the heat and noise. Director Bailey's face was slightly pale. Looking at Madman Lee's face, his fingers hanging by the side of his pants trembled slightly. He was afraid, but it did not mean that everyone in the department was afraid. The Joint Investigation Department had a rare high level of authority and directly reported to the President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Over the years, they had wreaked havoc in the Capitol Ring's official and judicial circles, but they had never encountered a real challenge. This was especially true for the high-ranking officers from the Bureau of Proclamation. They had long been used to standing on the highest hill and looking at the targets they were investigating. Neo, who had been named, was one of them. He had entered the Bureau of Proclamation directly after graduating from university. Other than the 3 years of contact with the normal Federation Society in the Joint Investigation Department, he had always worked in that mysterious organization. Bathing in the sacred and inviolable the glory of the Charter for too long, he had naturally formed the same sacred and inviolable concept of the Bureau of Proclamation officials. He walked past Director Bailey, looked at Madman Lee's face, and said with a smile, "I'm sorry, but I can't stay according to your request, because my personal connections are still with the Bureau of Proclamation. Although you have an amazing family background, I think you still don't have the authority to arrest officials of the Bureau of Proclamation." His expression was that of a smile, and he even apologized. But to say such words in such a situation, there was a sense of pride and contempt in his indifference. The mysterious and powerful Bureau of Proclamation was the cornerstone of the entire Federation. No matter how powerful the government was, no one dared to go against the wishes of this organization. Even Parliament Hill and the office of the President had to show sufficient respect to this existence. This was a deeply rooted tradition or rule of the Federation. Even the federal military had to somewhat cowardly abide by all of this. They could only watch as the technical officers stayed in the base like bosses, contemptuously commanding the reconstruction and activation of the Charter network. In countless years, only a few years ago in the battleship 3320, Su Lu, who had the highest authority, had acted arrogantly in front of the entire Bureau of Proclamation. Today, in Area Y3 of the base, who had the authority to intimidate the Bureau of Proclamation, in the minds of Donglin, Feng Yu had educated Su Lu. In the wetlands of the suburbs of the capital, he had also taught Su Lu. The glory of the Charter was powerful, and its authority was terrifying, but in the end, it was still people who carried out the Charter. This also meant that the upper limit of the glory of the Charter's power was determined by the upper limit of the ability of the person carrying out the Charter. Madman Lee didn't know that his granduncle, who had fought against the glory of the Charter for his entire life, had once made a precise plan for this situation. He simply carried out the highest rule in the army. Whoever had a gun was the boss. Therefore, he raised the gun in his hand, aimed at the Bureau of Proclamation official called Neo, and pulled the trigger expressionlessly. Following the crisp sound of the gunshot, a spray of blood suddenly erupted from the back of Neo's head. Then, a deep bloody hole slowly appeared between his eyebrows, like the shocked and confused third eye of a monster. With a muffled bang, the Bureau of Proclamation official's body fell heavily to the ground like a sack stuffed with graphite ore. He bounced up slightly, then went stiff without feeling anything. The clear and spiraling sound of the gunshot reverberated throughout the base. It wasn't very loud, but it shook the eardrums of the 400 to 500 people a little and set off a storm in their minds. The soldiers of the new 17th Division didn't expect to see this scene, but after the shock subsided, they immediately felt an unprecedented joy. They felt pain for the innocent brothers who had died in the Southwest War Zone, and they felt joy for the bloody price of these sinister officials. Inside a MX Mecha in the northwest corner, Hua Xiaoxi watched the scene seriously through the optical system. The corners of his lips cracked open slightly in silent joy. In the division headquarters, Madman Lee had once told them that in order to become a true member of the new 17th Division, one had to be ruthless enough. That dead Bureau of Proclamation official was clear proof. So this is what it means to be ruthless. With just a few words, a high-ranking Bureau of Proclamation official, was turned into an ice-cold corpse under Madman Lee's gun. The elites of the Small Eyes unit naturally felt the complete opposite of the new 17th Division. Most of them stared at Madman Lee's face with indescribable shock, trying to find a trace of ruthlessness or perversion on this young division commander's face. But they couldn't find anything. There was only calmness or perhaps apathy. A small number of elites of the Small Eyes unit, who hadn't been disarmed, tried to pick up the guns by their feet under this mental attack. But then they heard the air behind them vibrate abruptly, stabbing into their backs like steel needles. Dozens of black MX mecha adjusted their postures slightly like cold steel giants. Their bodies tilted forward, and the Darlin autocannons on their mechanical arms began to rotate at high speed at the same time. The shrill humming sounds stacked together, terrifying to behold. The stance of the new 17th Division was very clear. If the special forces of the Small Eyes unit dared to fire back at this time, then the mecha group with the absolute advantage would definitely not mind using tens of thousands of bullets thicker than fingers to turn them all into minced meat. Director Bailey was very cold. From the moment Madman Lee stepped out of the military vehicle, this famous conspiracy expert, who struck fear into the hearts of countless important figures in the Federation government and society, had begun to feel cold and fearful. Until now, the chill had penetrated his chest and settled on his back, causing the beads of sweat to freeze. At the beginning, he hadn't understood why the new 17th Division wasn't willing to talk to him, and why Madman Lee was ignoring him. Only now did he understand. Who would be willing to waste time talking to a person who was about to die? The new 17th Division's crazy charge into the Federation headquarters base was not to make the Joint Investigation Department bow their noble and proud heads, but to directly chop off their heads. Did they think they could just kill him and his people so easily? Did they not need to investigate, interrogate, or even assign a crime? Did they not need to use torture to extract some evidence, or forge some evidence? Director Bailey stared at Madman Lee not far in front of him, as well as the officers and soldiers of the new 17th Division, who were in an excited and dangerous state. He couldn't understand this phenomenon that went against his aesthetic and political ideals. Under the threat of death, his slightly trembling right hand reached uncontrollably towards his waist, almost touching the gun handle. Now that the situation had developed to this point, everyone present was sure of one fact. A cold, cruel, and undeniable fact. The 9 people who had been named by Hele would definitely be killed by the new 17th Division today. One of them was already dead, slumped on the ground. 2 of the people who had been named were commanders of the Small Eyes Special Forces. As mentally and physically strong soldiers, they weren't willing to die just like that. Faced with such a cruel prospect, their gazes drifted towards the scene. Where their gazes landed, a few of the commanders who were loyal to the death stared at the ground beneath their feet. They didn't seem to have any interaction, but suddenly their bodies tensed up, and they pounced forward like ferocious tigers, holding military knives in their hands. Their target was Madman Lee, who was standing at the front. As long as they subdued this person, the Small Eyes Special Forces would be able to regain control of the current situation. At least they would have some room to bargain, and they should be able to save the commander's life. Several tiger shadows pounced, and in exchange, a few crisp sounds rang out. These reckless fellows were struck by a leg lightning bolt, and were sent flying more than 20 meters away. They spat out blood as they fell into the dust, and it was unknown whether they were dead or alive. They had charged over like ferocious tigers, and then turned into a few sick cats. That was because the young commander they had attacked was the Real Tiger. He was a tiger with the aura of the Westwood's thin tiger in his chest. A tiger that had grown up on the bloody battlefield. Madman Lee pulled back his right leg expressionlessly, and turned his head to stare coldly at Director Bailey's face. He didn't look at the hand that was reaching for his waist, but his gaze gradually became violent, and he lashed out viciously like a flaming whip. "If you kill us, how are you going to explain it to the Federation?" Director Bailey asked in a trembling voice. "Even if you are Madman Lee, no one can protect you." "That's my problem. I brought the troops to the base to kill you, of course. Do you expect me to send you to the military court and instill the spirit of the law in the troops while I'm at it? Madman Li said. I just said that the way soldiers solve problems has always been more violent and direct, and it's even more so for me. Area 1 of the base was silent, or rather dead silent. After the new 17th Division entered the base, all the federal forces seemed to have disappeared into thin air, and all the heavy weapons seemed to have lost their effectiveness at the same time. Director Bailey looked in the direction of the headquarters, and he knew that some people were coldly watching this scene in the dark. He knew that no one would come to save him, and he sank into true despair. Then he turned around and saw Madman Li's flaming gaze. As if burned by the heat of the gaze, his right hand uncontrollably gripped the handle of his gun, and he suddenly pulled it out and aimed at Madman Li's body. The second gunshot of the day. The muzzle of the gun in Madman Li's hand emitted wisps of smoke. It wasn't to pity Director Bailey, who was lying in a pool of blood on the ground, but to pay tribute to those comrades who should have died on the battlefield, but had died in the hands of despicable people. Chapter 925. Pa. 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 After the second gunshot, there was a third and fourth. They were crisp and quiet. The walls of Area Y3 of the base were covered in blood and dust, including Director Bailey, 7 officers of the Joint Investigation Department, who had framed the NTR unit of the new 10th Division, had died. The 2 beady-eyed commanders who were in charge of chasing down the lone soldier and causing the deaths of 8 federal soldiers had also turned into ice-cold corpses. Madman Li looked at the 300 small-eyed elites who were either angry, sad, or frightened. He said, "If you don't want today to turn into a massacre, then don't move. Obediently board the ship and leave. You aren't real soldiers, so you don't have the right to stay on the front lines. When you return to the capital ring, tell your highest commander." He continued, "That is, that Chairman Li Jae-do. I don't care what he's doing behind the scenes, but if he dares to send those officials and you to the front lines next time, I'll kill every single one of them I see." In the depths of the base, in the room that seemed to always be dark, the highest commander of the Federation military front lines, Lieutenant General Hu Lian, looked at the young colonel in front of him with a livid face. He slammed the table angrily and reprimanded him sternly. Using a violent machine to execute high-ranking Federation officials without trial, and 9 of them at once. Where did you get the guts to do that? Li Feng's expression was no different from when he was supervising the executions in Area Y3 of the base. He was still calm and indifferent. Only the clear light in his eyes showed that he had already shaken off that crazy and violent mood. He wasn't interested in listening to the commander's reprimand. His eyes moved around the dark room. He felt that after Du Xiaoqing left the front lines, the windows of the headquarters room seemed to always be covered with black curtains. It made him feel a little unhappy. Do you know? If this matter spreads, it will definitely become the biggest scandal in the history of the Federation military. I don't care if you are some bullshit war hero or the youngest colonel commander. You will be finished. Lieutenant General Hu Lian angrily tore open the military discipline buckle and pointed at his nose. It's one thing to kill those 2 small-eyed commanders, but you dare to kill the officers of the Joint Investigation Department? Don't forget that there are 4 people in there from the Bureau of Proclamation. How are you going to explain this to the Bureau of Proclamation? How do we explain this to the Federation? Li Feng replied expressionlessly, "If Director Cui Zedong has an opinion, I think he will directly target me and not put pressure on the military." Lieutenant General Hu Lian was suddenly at a loss for words. His fingers trembled as he didn't know what to say. As for why I want to kill people, you should know very well that a character like Director Bailey will only use those dirty tricks to bite people like a mad dog. If such a person stays at the front line, the mood of the soldiers will become worse and worse, and it may even cause a real mutiny. Lieutenant General Hu Lian gradually calmed down. He looked at him with a frown and asked with a serious expression, "How do we deal with this matter next? You executed a government official in public. No matter what, you can't hide it. According to military regulations, Battles where the death toll does not exceed 10 people do not need to be reported to the Ministry of Defense, and the rear agency has no right to ask. Li Feng replied. Today, 9 officials were executed in the Y3 area of the base. The limit of 10 people was not exceeded. As long as the frontline forces kept it a secret from top to bottom, it would not be difficult to turn this bloody incident into a surprise attack by the Empire. Lieutenant General Hu Lian stared at his calm face. He wanted to confirm whether this was an excuse that he had thought of beforehand, or if it was just a moment of inspiration. For the first time, he realized that there was actually such a meticulous strategic ability in the body of this crazy young man. Suddenly, His Excellency felt like Director Bailey was already dead. He silently thought to himself, if the military regulations of the Federation limited the death toll to more than 10 people, then how many people would have died in the base today? Would he have died? Let's not talk about the glory of the Charter. Even if all the soldiers in the frontline forces kept silent about this incident, how are you going to make those 300 Small-eyed soldiers shut up? The Special Forces of Small-eyed Soldiers belong to the 1st Military Region. We all know who these people belong to. After knowing the truth about the explosion of the ancient bell, Madman Li no longer called that person father. After a moment of silence, he said, Chairman Li Jiedu can make them shut up. I believe that President Pabre also doesn't want the media to know about this incident. As for you, Mr. General, now that Su Lu is no longer in the army, I am the only hero. If the military doesn't protect me, who will they protect? Li Feng said. To be more precise, the military would rather protect me than you. So if you want to protect yourself, you must first protect this incident. As for how to make the frontline forces forget about what happened today, I'll leave it to you. Lieutenant General Hu Lian's beard trembled slightly, representing the anger in his heart. As the highest commander in the Federation's frontline, he did not find the slightest bit of respect, or even equality in the tone of this young commander in front of him. This young man's attitude was as if he was the commander. However, he could not be angry, because the bloody incident caused by the new 17th Division did not involve the headquarters. If the new 17th Division, or Madman Li, insisted on finding out who was responsible, how could he and the headquarters stay out of it? I've said before that the army cannot be in chaos, so this incident will not involve you. However, I think today's incident should wake you up a little. Su Lu has returned to the Federation. Madman Li detonated a bomb without any warning. He stared at Lieutenant General Hu Lian, whose expression changed drastically, and said, a lot of things will happen in the capital ring. Those things are not something you can get involved in. Lieutenant General Hu Lian frowned and did not say anything. Madman Li looked at him and said with slight mockery, if you had the right to get involved in those things, Commander Xiaoqing would not have been transferred back by His Excellency the President. Wei Chaoshu definitely knows about this. The Empire's army will definitely not let go of this opportunity. So your current mission is to command the army and prepare for another battle with the Empire's army, Li Feng said. And my mission is to fight the Empire's army under your leadership, and at the same time, crush all the bugs that come from the rear to cause trouble. Lieutenant General Hu Lian knew that this was the condition the other had proposed. After a long period of silent consideration, he slowly nodded. Perhaps there really was a wall in the world that could block out all the gales. But there was definitely no secret that could be hidden forever. At least for Li Jiedu, who controlled all the secret organizations of the Federation government. In less than 2 hours after the cold-blooded shooting incident on planet Emohua, the detailed report of the incident had already been delivered to the table in front of him. In the report, the details of the incident were described in an extremely objective and calm manner, as if the narrator was on the scene, or even one of the people involved. This was the work requirement that Li Jiedu had for the Joint Investigation Department. He believed that this objectivity had nothing to do with the person involved being his own son. The slightly cold coffee was still rippling in the porcelain white cup. Li Jiedu walked to the window and looked at the cold scenery of the capital. Looking at the leaves swaying under his feet after the rain, a self-mocking smile appeared on his calm face. The incident report was suppressed by him. Except for His Excellency the President, no one in the capital ring knew what his own son had done at the front line. There might be rumors after the incident, but so what? Because I'm your father, you can't kill me to avenge Commander Zhong. So no matter what you do, I have to cover it up for you, because you're my son. Li Jiedu looked out of the window calmly, thinking of his son who he had not seen for 3 years, countless light years away. He sighed silently in his heart. The major battle at the front line has ended. The battle at the Strait on planet Emohua was a complete victory. Colonel Li Feng, who is that madman Li, fought particularly fiercely. The only bad news is that the team of the Joint Investigation Department stationed at the front line was ambushed by a special force of the Empire in the Southwest War Zone. 7 senior officials and 2 field commanders were killed. Sigh, speaking of which, these people were all my colleagues. They were too unlucky to encounter such an incident on the first time the department went to the front line. It had been more than 3 years since he was transferred from the Research Institute to the Joint Investigation Department. But Chen Yijiang still maintained that wooden look. He took a sip of coffee, looked at the 2 people across the table, and said, I heard that because of this reason, the frontline command was very dissatisfied with the Small Eyes team and drove them all back. Thank you for telling us this news. Speaking of which, you arrested me for treason, but you couldn't produce any evidence. How long are you going to lock us up? We're not allowed to contact the outside world, and we're not even allowed to read the newspapers. We can only listen to you tell us these stories every day. Sitting across the table were Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood angrily rubbed his tangled curly hair and complained incessantly, while Chief Editor Bob was concentrating on tasting his coffee, enjoying it very much. Chen Yijiang pushed the glasses on the bridge of his nose and said slowly, that money has corrupted the middle and lower structure of the government and the entire political environment. At this time, you still want to speak for them. I don't understand. Wood leaned his body on the chair and looked at him mockingly. Does criticizing the government mean that you're speaking for those big families? But Mr. President and the government always want to do something good. They want to change the current decadent federation status quo and achieve true democracy. What is true democracy? Is it the democracy that those thugs in South Kazhou want to kill your whole family? Wood's harsh and vicious tone made Chen Yijiang very uncomfortable. Although this kind of chat over coffee every few days had been done many times, it was still in a state where no one could convince the other. You think that the election under the control of the big families represents true democracy? The Federation needs unity the most now. What Mr. President needs most now is support, not doubt. If we don't unite, how can we win this war with the Empire? If the government doesn't use these strong means, how can the entire political machine operate well and support this war? The body of the Federation has decayed too much. If we don't use a sharp knife, how can we cut off the rotten flesh and restore health? Chapter 926. Wood mocked with a smile. You seem to have memorized more and more political terms after a few chats. You seem to have read Mr. President's speech many times, haven't you? Chen Yijiang scratched his head embarrassedly and said, yes. Wood mocked. Pabre is quite fast with the knife. He's not worried that he'll cut off the good meat that isn't abscesses anyway. Chen Yijiang hesitated for a moment and said, there are always some inevitable sacrifices. Bob had been drinking his coffee in silence, and with a smile. After hearing this, the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He put down the coffee cup and said softly, this has been repeated many times. An involuntary sacrifice can't be called a sacrifice. It can be called being sacrificed or murder. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Chen Yijiang got off work. Bob and Wood looked at the raindrops and body pieces on the window with ugly expressions. The light in the room suddenly brightened up and shone on the faces of the 2 reporters. Every wrinkle and the tiniest spot were illuminated clearly. It was not until now that the haggard and exhausted faces could be seen clearly. Having been restricted by the Federation government for more than a month, The life of a prisoner was definitely not the luxurious afternoon tea time that it used to be. For people with strong enough minds, their bodies were on the verge of collapse. Behind the unusually bright light that made it impossible for people to get rid of their tiredness through drowsiness were several officers of the Joint Investigation Department in black formal suits. Their faces could not be seen clearly, only vague outlines could be seen, and the cold and sharp sound of metal grinding could be heard. Citizen number SL6546789322153 Bob. Citizen number SL65560835245 Wood. According to Article 4, Section 77 of the Patriot Act, your detention will be extended by 7 days. The Joint Investigation Department has completed this reading in accordance with the Special Authority Act and the authorization of the Bureau of Proclamation. Wood covered his eyes with his hands and roared angrily. Why? The black shadow behind the light replied without any emotion. Due to the seriousness of the suspected crime and the complexity of the investigation, the suspect is extremely uncooperative, so we need to extend the detention time to complete the investigation. Wood angrily grabbed his tangled curly hair and slammed the table, shouting, "Do you want to keep us locked up like this forever?" The black shadow replied, "Of course not. According to the Special Authority Act, the maximum detention period of the Joint Investigation Department will not exceed 1 year." Wood fell into silence. He rubbed his sunken eyes and no longer spoke. The official in a black suit sat down. His eyes fell on Wood's thin face along with the dazzling incandescent light. He took out an electronic notebook and asked in a deep voice, "Regarding the special report in the Capital Special District Daily, how much money did you personally receive from the Sanlin United Bank?" There was no answer, only silence. Reporter Wood, your annual salary is more than 10 times the average salary of the Journalists' Union in the 70 years of the constitutional calendar. How do you explain this? Can we interpret this as a transfer of benefits from the Sanlin United Bank to you? This question could be answered. Wood was the only reporter in the Federation who could use a group of entertainment paparazzi to dig out so many secrets of Senator Macklin. Naturally, he was qualified to receive the highest level of salary. However, Chief Editor Bob and Wood had answered this question too many times. They knew that it was meaningless, so they still remained silent. Chief Editor Bob, the next question is directed at you. Among all the chief editors of the big newspapers on Old Newspaper Street, you are the only one who does not own a share in the newspaper. Why? There are 3 unnamed shareholders of the Capital Special District Daily. Are they your agents? What are you trying to hide? The high salary was bribed by the rich, but not having a share in the newspaper was considered a conspiracy. No explanation was needed. The Federation government did not need their explanation at all. They only needed them to admit their guilt, so they still remained silent. The 2 of you are famous in the Federation's news industry. I have always respected you, but I did not expect that you would betray your conscience for money. The official behind the light said sarcastically, "But please rest assured that the Joint Investigation Department has never used torture to extort confessions. I'm going to have a cup of coffee. Do you want to listen to a song?" The song was a dance song, but it was not graceful. The electronic noise blended in a very narrow range. If they heard this dance song on the street, Bob and Wood would at most smile with a coarse tobacco and laugh at each other's taste in their hearts. However, when the dance song was played at a volume beyond the human endurance, it became the most unbearable torture. The music had just started, and the volume was not turned up to the maximum. The officials had not yet walked out of the interrogation room. Like a good student who loved to show off, Reporter Wood raised his right hand high and shouted, "I admit it. I admit." Beside him, Editor-in-Chief Bob, who had an extremely complicated expression on his face, raised his left hand and shouted, "I raised my hand first. I admit that we did accept the black money from the Sanlin United Bank and deliberately framed the president." After saying this, the 2 of them looked at each other and saw the fear in each other's eyes. The so-called true warriors would never look at a stone in front of them and kick it. They would rather take a detour. This was what they thought. Where is the money? Through which channel was it transferred? Where did you meet the people related to the Lee family? When? Bob looked at Wood, thinking that he was the most famous reporter in the Federation's news industry. He wrote quickly and carefully. This difficult task could only be handed to him. Wood swallowed hard and tiredly held his forehead, trying to make up a perfect story that would not be easily exposed. However, the most important problem was that the two of them did not accept bribes from the Sanlin United Bank at all. They did not even meet with the people of the Lee family in private. The Joint Investigation Department would investigate all the clues, and if there was nothing, it would not become a real thing. The official in black looked at the two of them and sneered. He walked out of the interrogation room, and the dance song, which was more terrible than the noise, became louder and louder. Bob and Wood looked at each other and confirmed that the Federation government did not want to hear too much at all. They only wanted to torture themselves. They could not help but smile bitterly. The seemingly cheerful and witty life of a prisoner was, in fact, full of endless pain. In the noise, the two best reporters of the Federation held their heads with pale faces and collapsed in the chair in pain. They knew that the dance song would stop in half an hour. At that time, there would not be any injuries on their bodies. Even a lawyer would not have any way to complain to the government on their behalf. A thin plastic bag covered the head. The deformed face inside opened its mouth and breathed in panic, but could only breathe the air that came out of its lungs. It became more and more turbid and lifeless. The man whose head was covered by the plastic bag struggled in pain, but there was no way to break the high-strength plastic rope tied to his limbs. There was no way to escape the control of the men around him. Only when he was about to suffocate to death was the plastic bag taken off, and then a basin of cold water poured over him. Compared to the experience of Bob and Wood, the scene that happened in the secret interrogation room of the Federation Investigation Department of a state in S1 was obviously more cruel and cold-blooded. The man who was soaked in pain coughed and gasped. Like a fish that had been fished out of a pond, he stared at the picture in front of him that he had seen countless times. He cried and said, "Yes, yes. I remember. He was talking to this person in the corner of the reception party for half a day." The official holding the picture smiled and patted his face. He walked to the interrogation room next door and looked at the woman behind the table, who was in her 30s. There were traces of tears on her face. He said softly, "Your husband's closest colleague has admitted to that matter. Do you have anything to add?" In the 37th constitutional era, the Empire had quietly planted several seeds in the soil of the Federation. The most famous of them were, of course, Sulu and Macklin. Other than them, there was also an intelligence officer named Hiyu, because according to the investigation of the Federation, it was he who gave the top-secret itinerary of the ancient clock to the Empire, which eventually led to the explosion. In other words, this seed of the Empire was the most important person in the death of Zhong Shouhu. However, the truth was, before he was arrested by the hardliners of the federal military, he didn't even know that he was from the Empire. At that time, he was 36 years old. He had a waitress wife and a cute 4-year-old daughter. At this time, the woman behind the table in the interrogation room was Hiyu's wife, Rosie. She stared at the official with frightened eyes and said in a trembling voice, "I don't know. I don't know anything. I have never seen the person in the picture." The official's face quickly darkened. He slammed the table and shouted, "What are you trying to hide? Are you colluding with the Empire?" Rosie waved her hands in panic and said, "No, I have never seen anyone from the Empire in my life. How could I collude with someone from the Empire?" "Liar," the official said coldly. "Your husband, Hiyu, is from the Empire. How can you say that you have never seen anyone from the Empire?" Hearing that name, Rosie was very sad. She shouted in pain, "It's not like that. When I met Yu, he was not from the Empire, nor was he a spy. He just liked to eat my food. But he is a spy from the Empire." The official coldly and mercilessly tore apart the woman's emotions. He said, "The question now is, who exactly awakened this spy of the Empire and ordered him to do such an ugly thing?" That damn newspaper said that the person was Shiman Jean. Those idiots in society actually believed this. They didn't think about it. How could the great and invincible officer of the Iron 7th Division, the trusted subordinate of General Shaoqing, collude with someone from the Empire? The official's voice was cold and intrusive. He stared into the woman's eyes and said, "If you don't identify the real mastermind behind this, the Iron 7th Division, General Shaoqing, and even Mr. President will be humiliated because of this." Rosie didn't get any answer. She just trembled. She vaguely felt that this matter was very scary, but she didn't know what to say. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.